What happens when a teenager disappears without a trace, leaving behind only a missing suitcase and a family's claims of running away? What happens when that disappearance haunts a community for 3 decades, while a predator walks free among them? And what happens when the truth, buried 6 feet deep in a backyard garden, finally comes to light? Today on Cold Case Desk, we're diving deep into one of the most disturbing cases of parental deception in American criminal history. This is the story of Aundria Bowman, a 14-year-old girl who vanished from Holland, Michigan in 1989. For 30 years, investigators believed she had run away from home. Her face appeared in Soul Asylum's iconic music video for Runaway Train, broadcast to millions. Tips poured in from across the country. But Aundria was never found alive. The truth was far more sinister than anyone imagined, and it would take a DNA match from a cold case murder 700 miles away to finally bring justice to a girl who never had a chance to grow up. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you appreciate deep dives into cases that took decades to solve, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our investigations into cold cases that refuse to stay cold. Now let's unravel this mystery. To understand what happened to Aundria Bowman, we need to go back before she was even born. We need to understand the woman who gave her life and the man who would take it away. Our story begins not in Michigan, but in Virginia in the early 1970s. It begins with a child who was never wanted, who would make the ultimate sacrifice for her own daughter, only to discover decades later that her sacrifice had led to tragedy. Kathleen Turkanian, known to everyone as Kathy, was born into a family that viewed her as a burden from the moment she drew her first breath. Her parents made no secret of their feelings. They saw their daughter not as a blessing, but as an obligation, one they resented with every passing year. By the time Kathy reached her teenage years, the dysfunction in her household had become unbearable. She was a child living in a home where love was absent and criticism was constant. In 1972, when Kathy was still just a teenager herself, she made a decision that would change the trajectory of her life. She ran away. With no money in her pockets and no plan beyond escape, Kathy stuck out her thumb on the side of a Virginia highway and began hitchhiking. She had no destination in mind, only a desperate need to get as far away from her parents' house as possible. For days, she caught rides with strangers, sleeping wherever she could find shelter, eating whatever scraps came her way. The journey eventually took her to Memphis, Tennessee. It was there, in a city far from home, that she met a 19-year-old man named Randy Badger. Randy saw something in this runaway teenager that her own parents never had. He saw someone worth caring for. He offered her a place to stay, food to eat, and most importantly, a sense of stability she had never known. Their relationship developed quickly, as young love often does when built on the foundation of mutual need. By December of that same year, Randy and Kathy decided to get married. But there was a problem. Kathy was still a minor, and under Virginia law, she couldn't marry without parental consent. They found a solution in South Carolina. The laws there were more permissive. If a minor had parental permission, the state would issue a marriage license. Randy and Kathy contacted Kathy's parents, expecting resistance. To their surprise, the response came quickly and without hesitation. Yes, her parents would provide consent. The reason for their eagerness became immediately clear. By signing those papers, Kathy's parents were washing their hands of legal responsibility for their daughter. The moment she married, she became Randy's problem, not theirs. They were free. The wedding was small and unremarkable. There were no family celebrations, no well wishes for a long and happy life together. Just 2 teenagers signing papers in a courthouse, legally binding themselves to each other in the eyes of the law. The marriage that had seemed like salvation quickly revealed itself to be another form of instability. Randy and Kathy were both so young, neither emotionally nor financially prepared for the realities of adult life. They struggled to make ends meet. They argued. They grew apart almost as quickly as they had come together. Then in 1973, Kathy discovered she was pregnant. On June 23, 1974, Kathy gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Alexis. Holding her daughter for the first time, Kathy felt something she had never experienced in her parents' home. She felt unconditional love. She felt the fierce, protective instinct of a mother who would do anything for her child. But feeling that love and being able to provide for it were two different things entirely. By the time Alexis was 5 months old, the marriage between Kathy and Randy had completely collapsed. They separated, and Kathy found herself in an impossible situation. She was barely out of her teens herself, with no education, no job prospects, and a baby to care for. Against her better judgment, she returned to her parents' home in Virginia, hoping that perhaps the presence of a grandchild might soften their hearts. It didn't. Kathy's parents made it clear that they had no intention of providing financial support. They had no interest in helping raise a grandchild. They had barely wanted to raise their own daughter. The atmosphere in the house was cold and unwelcoming. Kathy could see that she and Alexis were just as much a burden to them now as she had been throughout her childhood. The reality of her situation became increasingly clear with each passing day. She was living in a home that didn't want her, with no income and no prospects. She looked at her daughter, this perfect, innocent baby who deserved so much more than what Kathy could give her, and she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. When Alexis was just 9 months old, Kathy made the agonizing choice to surrender her daughter to the adoption system in Norfolk, Virginia. It was a closed adoption, meaning that once the papers were signed, all legal ties would be severed. Kathy would have no rights to know where her daughter went or who raised her. The door would close completely. The day she handed Alexis over, Kathy's heart shattered into pieces. But she told herself it was the right thing to do. She told herself that her daughter would be placed with a family who could give her everything. A stable home, 2 parents who wanted a child desperately, financial security, love. As she walked away from the adoption agency that day, Kathy clung to one fragile hope. She hoped that one day when Alexis was grown, she would come looking for her birth mother. She hoped they would reunite and she could explain why she had made this impossible choice. She hoped her daughter would understand that giving her up was an act of love, not abandonment. Kathy couldn't have known, as she walked out of that building with empty arms and a broken heart, that she had just handed her daughter to a monster. While Kathy Turkanian was making the hardest decision of her young life, a couple 700 miles away in Holland, Michigan was searching desperately for a child to call their own. Dennis and Brenda Bowman presented themselves as the picture of Midwestern stability and Christian values. To their neighbors and congregation, they were a devoted couple who embodied everything good about small-town American life. Dennis Lee Bowman was a former Navy reservist who had served his country with distinction, or so the story went. He was a wood machinist by trade, working steady hours at a local manufacturing plant. With his reddish-brown hair, neatly trimmed goatee, and wire-rimmed glasses, he had an almost scholarly appearance. He was quiet and reserved in public, the kind of man who kept to himself but was always polite when spoken to. Brenda was a heavy-set woman with curled bangs and a warm smile. She had previously worked at the jewelry counter of the local Meyer department store, where she was known for her friendly demeanor and helpful attitude toward customers. She was active in their Catholic church, always volunteering for charity drives and community events. Together, Dennis and Brenda were fixtures at St. Francis de Sales Church in Holland. They taught Sunday school to children, organized fundraisers, and never missed a Sunday service. Their faith, they told everyone, was the foundation of their marriage and their lives. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, there was a darkness that no one could see. Not yet. The Bowmans desperately wanted to be parents, but biology had placed an obstacle in their path. Brenda suffered from a rare congenital condition called uterus didelphys, more commonly known as having a double uterus. This condition made conception difficult and carrying a pregnancy to term even more challenging. Month after month, year after year, they tried without success. After consulting with doctors and exploring their options, Dennis and Brenda made the decision to pursue adoption. They contacted adoption agencies, filled out the necessary paperwork, underwent home studies, and presented themselves as ideal candidates for parenthood. And why wouldn't they be approved? They had a stable home, steady income, strong ties to their community, and a deep religious faith. On paper, they were perfect. The adoption system matched them with a 9-month-old baby girl from Norfolk, Virginia. The child's birth mother had surrendered her due to financial hardship. The baby was healthy, alert, and ready for placement with a loving family. In 1975, Dennis and Brenda Bowman brought the infant girl home to Holland, Michigan. They renamed her Andrea Michelle Bowman, erasing her birth identity completely. The name Alexis Turkanian ceased to exist in any legal documentation. As far as the world was concerned, this child had always been Andrea Bowman, daughter of Dennis and Brenda. For the first several years of Andrea's life, she was the center of the Bowman household. As an only child, she received all of her parents' attention. Brenda doted on her, dressing her in pretty outfits and taking her to church activities. Dennis taught her to ride a bike in the driveway of their farmhouse on Lincoln Road, a property located at the corner of 52nd Street in rural Ottawa County. The farmhouse itself was an older structure, set back from the road with a large yard and outbuildings including a barn. It was the kind of place where children could run and play, where families raised gardens and kept chickens. To outsiders, it looked like an idyllic setting for a childhood. Andrea attended local schools and participated in the band program. She had friends in the neighborhood and seemed, to most people who knew her casually, like a normal kid growing up in a normal family. But inside the walls of that farmhouse, a very different reality was taking shape. For nearly 14 years, Andrea Bowman was the sole focus of Dennis and Brenda's household. She was their daughter, their only child, the center of their world. But in January 1988, everything changed in a way that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of Andrea's life. Against all medical odds, Brenda Bowman successfully carried a pregnancy to term. On a cold winter day, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Vanessa. The arrival of Vanessa was celebrated as a miracle by the Bowman family and their congregation. After years of fertility struggles, God had finally blessed them with a biological child. Friends from church brought casseroles and baby gifts. The priest made a special announcement during Sunday service. The Bowmans were now a complete family, or so it seemed. For 14-year-old Andrea, the arrival of her baby sister marked the beginning of a new and much more difficult chapter in her life. Overnight, she went from being the center of attention to being relegated to the role of caretaker, and not just any caretaker, but essentially a third parent to the infant. While other teenage girls in Holland were joining after-school clubs, going to Friday night football games, meeting friends at the mall, and navigating the normal social landscape of adolescence, Andrea's life became consumed with childcare responsibilities. She spent her afternoons and weekends changing diapers, warming bottles, and soothing a crying baby. She rocked Vanessa to sleep. She gave her baths. She watched her while Dennis and Brenda went about their own activities. Friends from school noticed that Andrea stopped showing up to band practices regularly. She stopped accepting invitations to hang out after school. When asked why, she would simply say she had to get home to help with her baby sister. At first, her friends thought this was temporary, just while her parents adjusted to having a newborn. But weeks turned into months, and Andrea remained trapped in this role. The burden placed on Andrea's shoulders was not just about babysitting, it was about the complete shift in how she was valued within her own family. Where once she had been their daughter, now she had become the help. The biological child, the miracle baby, became the focus of Dennis and Brenda's love and attention. Andrea became the worker who made that focus possible, but the responsibilities and the shift in attention were not the worst of what was happening behind the closed doors of the Bowman farmhouse. There were darker things occurring, things that Andrea could not speak about openly without fear of terrible consequences. Whispers had begun to circulate in the community, the kind of quiet gossip that people shared in hushed tones but never acted upon. Something wasn't right in the Bowman household. People could sense it, even if they couldn't quite put their finger on what exactly was wrong. One incident in particular fueled the rumors throughout Andrea's middle school. One morning, Andrea boarded the school bus with her wrist visibly bloody. The sight immediately caught the attention of other students, and word spread quickly through the bus and then through the school hallways. Some students whispered that Andrea had attempted to take her own life, that the blood on her wrist was from a deliberate act of self-harm. Others told a different story. They said that Dennis and Brenda had locked Andrea out of the house the night before, and she had cut herself trying to climb back in through a window. Both versions of the story painted a disturbing picture of a girl in crisis. There were also stories about Dennis's temper. Neighbors occasionally heard raised voices coming from the Bowman property, though they couldn't make out the words. They noticed that Andrea seemed withdrawn and quiet, nothing like the bright, cheerful child she had been in earlier years. But this was rural Michigan in the 1980s, a time and place where what happened behind closed doors stayed behind closed doors. People minded their own business. Church-going families like the Bowmans were given the benefit of the doubt. After all, Dennis and Brenda were respected members of the community. They taught Sunday school. They helped with charity drives. Surely any difficulties they were having with a teenage daughter were just normal parenting challenges, blown out of proportion by adolescent drama and gossip. Looking back, with the benefit of hindsight and the knowledge of what was truly happening in that house, the warning signs seem impossible to miss. But at the time, in that community, with those social dynamics, the signals were ignored. Andrea's silent cries for help went unheard. And then came November 1988, a moment that should have changed everything. Andrea was in school one day when she found the courage to do something terrifying. She confided in a teacher, telling her that she was afraid to go home. When the teacher asked why, Andrea revealed something that made the educator's blood run cold. She said that her father was abusing her. The teacher did exactly what she was supposed to do. She immediately reported the disclosure to the school administration, who in turn contacted Child Protective Services. A social worker was assigned to investigate the allegation. This was it, the moment when the system should have intervened, when Andrea should have been removed from danger and given the protection she desperately needed. The social worker went to the Bowman residence to interview the family. Dennis and Brenda were ready for the visit. When confronted with Andrea's allegation, they responded with a carefully crafted explanation that would prove devastatingly effective. They told the social worker that Andrea was acting out. They explained that she had recently learned she was adopted and was very upset about this revelation. They suggested that Andrea was angry at them for not being her biological parents and was fabricating stories to get revenge or to get attention. They painted a picture of a troubled, rebellious teenager who was saying outrageous things because she was emotionally disturbed by learning about her adoption. The social worker, faced with this explanation from two respectable church-going adults who seemed genuinely concerned about their daughter's emotional well-being, accepted their version of events. The allegation was dismissed as the acting out of an angry adolescent. No further investigation was conducted. Andrea was left in the home. The police were notified of the report, as was protocol, but they too accepted the explanation that this was simply teenage rebellion. They logged the report in their files and moved on. No charges were filed, no follow-up visits were scheduled. Andrea had reached out for help from the one place she thought might save her. She had found the courage to speak the truth to a trusted adult, and the system had failed her completely. One can only imagine the despair Andrea must have felt when she realized that no one was coming to rescue her. No one believed her. She was trapped in that house with Dennis Bowman, a man she had just accused of abuse, and now he knew that she had tried to expose him. The psychological terror of that situation is almost unimaginable. The months following that failed intervention must have been hell for Andrea. She was stuck in a home where her adopted father was abusing her, where her adopted mother either didn't know or didn't want to know, and where her primary responsibility was caring for the baby who had displaced her in the family hierarchy. She was 14 years old with nowhere to turn and no one to help her. The pressure inside that household was building to a breaking point. Something was going to give. And on March 11th, 1989, it did. March 11th, 1989, started like any other Saturday in the Bowman household. The sky over Ottawa County was overcast, typical for early spring in Michigan, when winter reluctantly releases its grip and the first hints of warmer weather remain maddeningly out of reach. Dennis Bowman woke early that morning. He had volunteered to drive 14-year-old Andrea to her school for a band event. Andrea was in the school band, and despite everything else happening in her life, she continued to participate in this one activity that gave her a sense of normalcy and connection to her peers. According to Dennis's later statements to police, he picked Andrea up mid-morning and drove her to the school. The drive from their farmhouse on Lincoln Road to the school was not long, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes depending on traffic. Dennis claimed that the car ride was quiet, that Andrea seemed withdrawn and moody, which he attributed to typical teenage attitude. The band event lasted several hours. Dennis returned to the school in the afternoon to collect Andrea and bring her home. Again, according to his account, the drive home was tense and silent. Andrea sat in the passenger seat staring out the window, not speaking. When they arrived back at the farmhouse, Brenda was preparing to leave for her job. She worked the second shift, which meant her hours typically ran from late afternoon through late evening. Dennis needed to drive her to work, and he planned to take baby Vanessa with him so that Andrea could focus on her homework in peace and quiet. This arrangement was not unusual. Andrea was often left alone at the house for short periods, while Dennis ran errands or drove Brenda to and from work. At 14, she was considered old enough and responsible enough to be home alone for a few hours. Dennis drove Brenda to her workplace with Vanessa secured in a car seat in the back. The baby was about 14 months old at this point, chubby-cheeked with reddish hair like her mother, still in diapers and completely dependent on her parents for everything. After dropping Brenda off at work, Dennis drove around for a while, perhaps running errands, perhaps just killing time until it was reasonable to head back home. He returned to the farmhouse on Lincoln Road around 6:30 in the evening, Vanessa still with him. As he pulled into the driveway, Dennis noticed that the house was completely dark. No lights were on in any of the windows. The sun had set, and the early spring evening had brought full darkness to the rural property. Dennis parked the car and carried Vanessa toward the house. He tried the front door and found it locked. He walked around to the back door, the one the family typically used for everyday comings and goings. That door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside, flicking on the kitchen light. "Andrea?" he called out. No response. The house was silent except for the normal creaks and settling sounds of an old farmhouse. Dennis placed baby Vanessa on the living room sofa and began walking through the house, turning on lights as he went. "Andrea?" he called again, louder this time. Still nothing. He checked the downstairs rooms. Empty. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He checked Andrea's bedroom. Empty. He checked the bathroom. Empty. Then he noticed something that made him pause. The door to the master bedroom, the room he shared with Brenda, was standing open. This was unusual because Dennis and Brenda kept their bedroom door locked at all times, a practice that might seem strange to outsiders, but which they claimed was simply about maintaining privacy. Dennis stepped into the master bedroom and immediately noticed that things were out of place. He went to the closet and saw that a small travel suitcase was missing. The couple kept several pieces of luggage in the closet, and the smallest one, a soft-sided overnight bag, was gone. His eyes swept the room. On the dresser, in the spot where he and Brenda had recently placed their tax refund, money and cash, there was nothing. The money was gone. He had yet to deposit it in the bank, planning to do so on Monday. Now it had vanished. Dennis walked back through the house, looking for other signs of what had happened. He checked Vanessa's nursery and noticed that the little ceramic piggy bank they kept on the shelf was lighter than it should be. He picked it up and shook it. The sound confirmed his suspicion. The coins that had been accumulating inside were gone. By the time Dennis had completed his search of the house, he had assembled a mental list of what was missing. One suitcase, the tax refund money, several $100s in cash, the coins from Vanessa's piggy bank, probably another $10 or $15, and Andrea herself. Dennis called Brenda at work and explained the situation. Andrea was gone, and it appeared she had taken money and clothes with her. Brenda was distraught but couldn't leave work immediately. She told Dennis she would come home as soon as her shift ended at 11:30 that night. When Brenda arrived home just before midnight, the house was still empty of Andrea. Brenda immediately went into panic mode. Despite her exhaustion from a full shift of work, she told Dennis she was going to drive around and look for their daughter. For hours that night and in the nights that followed, Brenda drove through Ottawa County searching for any sign of Andrea. She cruised slowly past the local truck stop, thinking maybe Andrea had hitchhiked. She drove through the neighborhoods where Andrea's school friends lived, hoping to spot her walking along a sidewalk or sitting on someone's porch. She scanned the faces of teenagers at the local burger joint in the video rental store. She drove down empty country roads, her headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating nothing but endless fields and the occasional barn or farmhouse. She checked ditches and looked for any sign of a person walking along the roadside. Brenda's search became obsessive. She barely slept, spending every free moment driving around looking for Andrea. She made flyers with Andrea's photo and hung them on telephone poles and in store windows. She called Andrea's friends and asked if they had seen her or knew where she might have gone. But after several days of this fruitless searching, Dennis told Brenda she had to stop. They still had baby Vanessa to take care of, he reminded her. They couldn't neglect their infant daughter because of Andrea's choice to run away. Reluctantly, Brenda scaled back her search efforts, though the pain of not knowing where Andrea was never left her. Dennis, meanwhile, had contacted the police to file a missing person report. When the officers arrived at the farmhouse to take the report, Dennis presented them with a narrative that seemed straightforward and believable. He explained that Andrea had been a troubled teenager for quite some time. She had recently learned that she was adopted, he said, and she had not taken the news well. She had become rebellious and difficult to manage. She frequently fought with her mother, Brenda, particularly about household responsibilities and rules. Dennis told the police that this was not even the first time Andrea had run away. He claimed that several months earlier, she had disappeared for a night and gone to stay at a friend's house without permission. She had been found and brought home, but the incident had shown that she was capable of leaving without warning. The evidence of this current disappearance supported the runaway narrative. The missing suitcase suggested she had packed clothes. The stolen money indicated she had planned to finance her time away from home. Even the coins from her baby sister's piggy bank suggested a level of premeditation and resourcefulness. The police officers took Dennis's statement and filed their report. Given the circumstances, the missing money and suitcase, the history of conflict in the home, and the claim of a previous runaway incident, they classified Andrea's disappearance as a runaway case. She was not considered a victim of foul play or an abduction. She was a troubled 14-year-old who had chosen to leave home. The case was passed along to the Youth Services Bureau, an organization that dealt specifically with runaway teenagers and family conflicts. Andrea's name and photograph were entered into the appropriate databases. Her school was notified. A missing person poster was created with her picture, physical description, and last known whereabouts. But there was no Amber Alert system in 1989. There was no social media to spread information instantly. The investigation into a runaway teenager was not given the same urgency or resources as a suspected abduction or homicide. Andrea Bowman became one of thousands of runaway teenagers reported in America every year, most of whom eventually turned up safe, and her case did not receive intensive investigative attention. In the days and weeks following Andrea's disappearance, the small community of Holland, Michigan buzzed with speculation and gossip. In a town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, the mystery of the missing Bowman girl became the subject of countless conversations at church gatherings, in grocery store checkout lines, and over backyard fences. Few people who knew the Bowmans well questioned the official narrative that Andrea had run away. The family had a reputation for being strict and religious, the kind of household where rules were important and discipline was taken seriously. It didn't seem far-fetched that a teenage girl might rebel against that environment and strike out on her own. But in the absence of concrete information, rumors rushed in to fill the void. People created their own theories about where Andrea had gone and why she had left, each story more elaborate than the last. One popular theory held that Andrea had gone searching for her biological mother. The fact that she had been adopted was common knowledge among the Bowman's church congregation, and some people speculated that learning about her adoption had sparked a desire to find her birth family. Perhaps, people whispered, Andrea had somehow discovered information about her biological mother's identity and had set out to find her in Virginia or wherever she might be living. Another rumor circulated that Andrea had been involved with an older boy from a nearby town, someone the Bowmans didn't approve of, and that she had run away to be with him. Variations on this story had the couple hitchhiking to Chicago or California or even Canada. Some versions had Andrea pregnant with this older boy's child, adding another layer of scandal to the tale. The local truck stop became a focal point for some of the darker speculation. The truck stop on Interstate 96 was a well-known landmark, the kind of place where long-haul truckers stop for fuel, food, and rest. Some people theorized that Andrea had hitchhiked to the truck stop and caught a ride with a trucker heading west or south, disappearing into the vast network of American highways where a young person could vanish completely if they wanted to. There were whispers, too, about the things that might befall a 14-year-old girl on her own in the world. People speculated quietly about human trafficking, about dangerous situations that a naive teenager might not recognize until it was too late. But these darker theories were usually shared in hushed tones and quickly dismissed with reassurances that Andrea was probably fine, just lying low somewhere until she decided to come home. Brenda Bowman, desperate for any information about her daughter's whereabouts, followed up on every tip and rumor that came her way. In the weeks and months after Andrea's disappearance, Brenda reported several potential sightings to police. One tip came from someone who claimed to have seen a girl matching Andrea's description at a bus station in Grand Rapids. Brenda drove to the station and searched the area, questioning people, showing Andrea's photo, but found nothing. Another report suggested that Andrea had been spotted at a shopping mall in Kalamazoo with a group of teenagers. Brenda made the hour-long drive and spent an entire day walking through the mall, studying the face of every teenage girl she saw, but never found Andrea. Each false lead, each dead end, took an emotional toll on Brenda. The hope that surged with every new tip was inevitably followed by crushing disappointment when the lead turned out to be nothing. But she continued to follow up on every single one because the alternative was unbearable. The alternative was accepting that she might never know what happened to her daughter. Dennis, by contrast, seemed more resigned to Andrea's absence. While Brenda chased leads and made desperate phone calls, Dennis went about his daily routine with an almost eerie sense of normalcy. He went to work at the wood machining plant. He attended church on Sundays. He took care of baby Vanessa. To neighbors and co-workers, he seemed like a man coping as well as could be expected with a difficult family situation. Some people noticed this difference in how the couple responded to Andrea's disappearance, but they attributed it to different coping mechanisms. Brenda was the emotional one, openly expressing her grief and fear. Dennis was the stoic one, keeping his feelings bottled up inside and maintaining a brave face for the sake of their younger daughter. No one considered the possibility that Dennis's calm demeanor might have a far more sinister explanation. By the summer of 1989, just a few months after Andrea's disappearance, Dennis and Brenda Bowman made a decision that surprised some of their neighbors. They put the farmhouse on Lincoln Road up for sale and prepared to move to a different town. The house where they had raised Andrea, where she had lived for nearly 14 years, was being left behind. When asked about the move, the Bowmans explained that the memories in the house were too painful for Brenda. Every time she walked past Andrea's empty bedroom, every time she sat at the dinner table where Andrea's chair now sat vacant, the pain was unbearable. A fresh start in a new place seemed like the healthiest option for their family, particularly for young Vanessa, who needed parents who could focus on her needs rather than being consumed by grief and uncertainty. The Bowmans moved to Hamilton, Michigan, a small town situated between Holland and Saugatuck. Their new home was on 134th Avenue, a quiet residential street where they quickly became just another family in the neighborhood. To their new neighbors, they were simply Dennis and Brenda with their young daughter Vanessa. Few people in Hamilton knew about Andrea or the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. This geographic distance from Holland also created a distance from the questions and the whispers. In Hamilton, the Bowmans could be seen as a normal family without the weight of tragedy hanging over them. Dennis found work at another manufacturing facility. Brenda became active in their new church community. Vanessa started preschool and made friends with other children in the neighborhood. Life, outwardly at least, moved on. But even as the Bowmans settled into their new normal, Andrea's case remained officially open, though increasingly cold. The missing person report was still in the system. Her name was still in the national database of missing children. But with no new leads, no sightings that panned out, and limited resources, the active investigation essentially stalled. Andrea Bowman became a statistic, one of the thousands of missing teenagers in America whose faces appeared on flyers that yellowed and curled at the edges before being replaced by other missing faces. For the most part, life in Holland moved on as well. There were new scandals to gossip about, new tragedies to focus on. Andrea's disappearance became an old story, the kind of thing people brought up occasionally when discussing unsolved local mysteries, but not something that consumed anyone's daily thoughts. In 1993, 4 years after Andrea's disappearance, something happened that brought her case briefly back into the public consciousness. though not in a way that ultimately helped find her. The alternative rock band Soul Asylum released a single titled Runaway Train from their album Grave Dancers Union. The song itself was a melancholy meditation on despair and loss, but it was the music video that accompanied the song that made it culturally significant. Director Tony Kaye conceived of the video as a public service announcement for missing children. Working with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Kaye created multiple versions of the video, each featuring photographs and information about missing children from different regions of the United States. The video was simple but emotionally powerful. It interspersed shots of the band performing the song with photographs of missing children. Each child's picture appeared on screen, along with their name, age, and the date they went missing. The video ended with contact information for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and a plea for anyone with information to call. Several different versions were created to air in different markets. The version that played on MTV and VH1 in the Michigan area featured local missing children, including Andrea Bowman. Andrea's school photograph, the one that showed her with green eyes, looking slightly upward past the camera, appeared at approximately the 2-minute mark in the Michigan version of the video. Her image was on screen for just a few seconds, but during the height of the song's popularity, that video played multiple times a day on music television. Runaway Train became a massive hit. It reached number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. The video went into heavy rotation on MTV during the summer of '93. For months, Andrea's face was broadcast into millions of homes across Michigan and surrounding states. The impact of the video was genuine and significant for many families. Years later, director Tony Kaye would claim that more than 24 missing children featured in various versions of the video were found as a direct result of the publicity it generated. People saw a face they recognized, made a phone call, and a child was brought home. But Andrea Bowman was not one of the success stories. Despite the massive exposure, despite the millions of people who saw her photograph flash across their television screens while Soul Asylum sang about darkness and despair, not a single credible tip came in that led to Andrea's whereabouts. The song eventually faded from the charts. The video stopped being in heavy rotation. By 1994, it was no longer playing regularly on music television, and Andrea's case went cold once again, colder than ever. The lack of results from such widespread publicity actually reinforced the belief among investigators that Andrea had simply chosen to disappear and was actively avoiding being found. After all, if she was alive somewhere and saw her own face on MTV, wouldn't she have reached out to someone? The assumption was that either Andrea was deliberately staying hidden or something had happened to her that made it impossible for her to respond. No one considered the possibility that Andrea had never left Ottawa County at all, that she had been 6 feet underground since the very night she supposedly ran away. The case of Andrea Bowman might have remained cold forever if not for the emergence of internet sleuths in the early 2000s, ordinary citizens who became obsessed with unsolved mysteries and dedicated their free time to trying to solve them from behind computer screens. One such person was a man named Carl Koppelman. Carl was not a professional investigator or a forensic expert. He was simply someone with a passion for true crime, a talent for digital art, and a deep well of empathy for the families of missing persons. Carl spent countless hours on a website called Web Sleuths, an online forum where amateur detectives from around the world collaborated on cold cases. The site was divided into different sections dedicated to various types of mysteries: missing persons, unidentified remains, unsolved homicides. Users shared theories, analyzed evidence, and sometimes even developed leads that they would pass along to law enforcement. Carl's particular area of focus was the intersection between missing persons and unidentified remains. He worked with a database called NAMUS, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, which cataloged both people who had disappeared and bodies that had been found but never identified. Carl's goal was to match them up, to give names to the nameless dead, and bring closure to families who had been searching for lost loved ones. One of the challenges in identifying unknown remains is that decomposition, time, and sometimes trauma can make bodies difficult to recognize, even for family members. Forensic artists can create facial reconstructions from skulls, But these are often imperfect and may not look exactly like the person did in life. Carl developed a skill for creating what he called post-mortem reconstruction images. Using photographs of unidentified deceased individuals, Carl would use digital imaging software to make them look more lifelike, sometimes adding color to black and white photos, or digitally adjusting features to approximate what the person might have looked like before death. He would then post these images online, hoping that someone would recognize their missing family member. In 2010, Carl became fixated on a case from Wisconsin that had haunted him since he first read about it. The case was known as the Racine County Jane Doe, and the details were heartbreaking. On July 21, 1999, the body of a young woman had been discovered in a rural area of Racine County, Wisconsin, near the edge of a cornfield. The person who found her was a farmer doing his morning rounds. At first, from a distance, he thought it might be a mannequin that someone had dumped illegally. As he got closer, the terrible truth became apparent. The young woman had been deceased for approximately 12 hours, according to the medical examiner's initial assessment. Rain had fallen the previous night, washing away crucial evidence that might have helped identify her or determine what had happened to her. The woman's body bore disturbing signs of long-term abuse and neglect. The autopsy revealed a tragic history written on her bones and tissue. She had multiple old fractures that had healed incorrectly over time, suggesting she had broken bones that were never properly set or treated medically. She had what medical examiners called a cauliflower ear, a deformity typically caused by repeated trauma to the ear that goes untreated. There were signs consistent with potential cognitive disability, though without knowing who she was, this couldn't be confirmed. The young woman was estimated to be between 18 and 30 years old. She was white, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, with brown hair. She was found wearing a men's gray and silver Western-style shirt with red floral embroidery, jeans, and white sneakers. Despite the clear evidence that this woman had led a difficult and possibly abused life, the local community rallied around her in death. A funeral was held, and more than 50 people from the farming community attended to mourn the stranger. She was buried in a local cemetery with a marker that read Jane Doe and the date she was found. The community wanted her to have dignity in death, even though she had been denied it in life. But no one ever came forward to identify her. No missing person report matched her description closely enough to generate a solid lead. She became one of those tragic cases that cold case investigators call the forgotten dead. A person with no name, no history, no one looking for her. Carl Koppelman was determined to change that. He began working with the Jane Doe's case file, such as it was available to the public. He studied the forensic photographs and the reconstruction attempts that had been done over the years. He looked at the details of where and how she was found, and then he started searching through the missing persons database with specific filters. Female, age range 18 to 30, white, brown hair, height around 5 feet 6 inches. Last seen sometime before July 1999. The database returned hundreds of possibilities. Carl began the painstaking process of eliminating matches that didn't quite fit. Wrong geographic region, wrong time frame, wrong physical characteristics, and then one entry made him stop scrolling. Andrea Michelle Bowman, last seen March 11, 1989, in Holland, Michigan. Green eyes, brown hair, approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall, age 14 at the time of disappearance, which would make her approximately 24 or 25 in 1999. Carl studied the school photograph of Andrea that was attached to her missing person file. He looked at the forensic photographs of the Racine County Jane Doe. He pulled up a map and traced the distance between Holland, Michigan, and Racine County, Wisconsin. Holland sat on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. Racine County was on the western shore. If you drove around the southern tip of the lake, the distance was approximately 4 hours. It was entirely plausible that someone from Holland could end up in Racine County. The timeline worked. Andrea disappeared in '89. The Jane Doe was found in '99. That meant Andrea would have been alive for 10 years after her disappearance, if she was the Jane Doe. It was possible that she had survived as a runaway for a decade before meeting a tragic end. The physical description was close enough to warrant investigation. Height was similar. Hair color matched. The age progression from 14 to 24 or 25 was reasonable. Carl became convinced he had found a match. He compiled his evidence and reached out to law enforcement agencies in both Michigan and Wisconsin, presenting his theory that Andrea Bowman and the Racine County Jane Doe might be the same person. To his surprise and relief, investigators took his theory seriously. The Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit reviewed his findings and agreed that the potential match was compelling enough to warrant DNA testing. But there was a problem. Andrea Bowman was adopted. Dennis and Brenda Bowman were not her biological parents, which meant their DNA wouldn't help confirm or rule out the identification. To test whether Andrea was the Racine County Jane Doe, investigators would need to locate and obtain DNA from Andrea's biological mother, which meant they needed to find Kathleen Turkanian, a woman who had given up her baby girl 35 years earlier and had no idea that the child she named Alexis had been renamed Andrea or had disappeared from her adoptive home. In April 2010, Kathy Turkanian received a letter that would shatter the fragile peace she had built in her life. Kathy was now in her 50s, living in Virginia. The decades since she had surrendered her baby daughter to adoption had been marked by quiet regret and persistent hope. She had wondered countless times over the years what had become of Alexis. Was she happy? Did she have a good family? Had she graduated high school and gone to college? Was she married? Did she have children of her own? Kathy had clung to the belief that one day Alexis would seek her out. Maybe when she turned 18 or 21, or when she had children of her own and wanted to know her medical history. Kathy had imagined that reunion countless times, the conversation they would have, the explanation she would give, the forgiveness she hoped to receive. But the letter that arrived that April day contained none of those hoped-for scenarios. The letter was from the Michigan State Police. It explained in formal law enforcement language that Kathy's biological daughter, whom she had surrendered for adoption in 1975, had disappeared from her adoptive home in Holland, Michigan in 1989. She had been 14 years old at the time. She was now considered a long-term missing person. Investigators believed there was a possibility that her daughter might be connected to an unidentified set of remains found in Wisconsin in 1999. The police were requesting Kathy's cooperation in providing a DNA sample to determine whether the Wisconsin Jane Doe was her biological daughter. Kathy read the letter multiple times, each reading revealing new layers of horror. Her daughter had been missing since 1989, 21 years ago. She had disappeared as a child, just 14 years old, and no one had thought to contact Kathy, the biological mother, until now. The letter raised more questions than it answered. Kathy hadn't even known that her daughter's name had been changed from Alexis to Andrea. She knew nothing about the family who had adopted her, except that they had been approved through the adoption agency. She had trusted the system to place her baby with good people who would love her and care for her and give her all the opportunities Kathy couldn't provide. Now she was learning that her daughter had disappeared, and worse, that she might have been dead for 11 years, buried in an unmarked grave in Wisconsin. Kathy immediately agreed to provide her DNA sample. She went to a local facility where a technician swabbed the inside of her cheek and packaged the sample for shipment to the forensic laboratory. Then she went home and did what any mother in the 21st century would do. She went online to search for information. She typed Andrea Bowman missing into Google and hit enter. The search results brought up news articles from 1989, brief mentions of a missing 14-year-old from Holland, Michigan. There were forum discussions on web sleuths where amateur detectives discussed the case. There were entries in missing persons databases. And there was the photograph. Kathy found the school photo of Andrea, the same image that had appeared in the Runaway Train video years earlier. She stared at the face of the teenage girl with green eyes and brown hair, trying to see the infant she had held 35 years earlier in this young woman's features. The experience of looking at that photograph was emotionally overwhelming. This was her daughter. The baby she had given up to give a better life was now a missing person, possibly dead, and Kathy had known nothing about it for 21 years. Kathy spent hours reading everything she could find online about Andrea's disappearance. She learned about the runaway theory. She read that Andrea had supposedly taken a suitcase and money and left home after fighting with her adoptive parents. But something about that story didn't sit right with Kathy. Maybe it was maternal instinct, or maybe it was the investigative curiosity of someone who needed answers. But Kathy couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than a simple runaway situation. She needed to know more about the family who had raised her daughter. She needed to understand who Dennis and Brenda Bowman were and what kind of home they had provided. Kathy reached out through online forums and eventually connected with Carl Koppelman, the cold case enthusiast who had first proposed the link between Andrea and the Racine County Jane Doe. Carl was sympathetic to Kathy's situation and wanted to help her find answers. Through Carl, Kathy was put in touch with a retired Michigan detective named Pat O'Reilly. O'Reilly had worked in Ottawa County during the time period when Andrea disappeared and was familiar with the case. He had always had suspicions about the official runaway narrative, but had never been able to prove anything different. When Kathy asked O'Reilly about Dennis Bowman, hoping to hear reassuring things about the man who had raised her daughter, what she learned instead turned her blood cold. O'Reilly didn't mince words. He told Kathy that Dennis Bowman had a criminal history. He suggested that if Kathy wanted to know the truth about what kind of man had been Andrea's adoptive father, she should file a Freedom of Information Act request for Dennis's criminal records. Kathy filed the request immediately. When the documents arrived several weeks later, she sat down with them at her kitchen table, unprepared for what she was about to read. The file that arrived at Kathy Turkanian's home was thick with incident reports, court documents, and newspaper clippings that painted a picture of Dennis Bowman that was radically different from the pious, church-going father he presented himself as. The earliest document in the file dated back to 1979, just 4 years after Dennis and Brenda had adopted Andrea. On a Sunday morning in November of that year, a 27-year-old woman in Holland, Michigan woke up to every person's worst nightmare. An intruder had broken into her home while she slept. Before she could scream or fight back, the man bound her hands and gagged her mouth. He then sexually assaulted her in her own bedroom. The woman survived the attack and immediately called police when the intruder fled. She provided a description of her attacker to a sketch artist. The resulting composite drawing showed a man with sandy brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses, a clean-shaven face, average build, probably in his late 20s or early 30s. The sketch was published in the Holland Sentinel newspaper as part of an appeal for information. Anyone who recognized the man was asked to contact the police department immediately. Within days, multiple people called in with the same tip. The man in the sketch looked like Dennis Bowman. Police brought Dennis in for questioning. Under interrogation, Dennis confessed to the crime. He admitted to breaking into the woman's home. He admitted to binding and gagging her. He admitted to the sexual assault. He was charged accordingly, but the case ultimately resulted in a plea deal. The details of that deal were not included in the documents Kathy received, but the outcome was that Dennis served minimal time, possibly just probation, and was released back into the community, back into the home where 4-year-old Andrea was living. If that had been the only incident in the file, it would have been disturbing enough, but there was more, much more. In May 1980, just 6 months after the home invasion case, another attack occurred. This time the victim was a 19-year-old woman who was riding her bicycle on a rural road north of Holland. It was a pleasant spring day, the kind where a young woman might go for a bike ride to enjoy the sunshine and fresh air. She was pedaling along a road that cut through farmland, probably thinking about her plans for the evening or humming along to a song in her head when she heard the sound of a motorcycle behind her. The motorcyclist pulled up alongside her and then suddenly swerved, forcing her off the road. The young woman struggled to maintain her balance and managed to stop without falling. Her heart was pounding. This was clearly not an accident. The motorcyclist stopped as well and dismounted. He walked toward the young woman and commanded her to get off her bike and walk into the woods that bordered the road. The young woman didn't move. Every instinct in her body was screaming that if she went into those woods with this man, she would not come out alive. The man pulled out a handgun from his jacket. He pointed at her and repeated the command, "Get off your bike. Walk into the woods." Still, the young woman didn't move. She stood there straddling her bicycle, frozen by fear but refusing to comply with the order that she knew would lead to her death. The man fired the gun. The bullet whizzed past the young woman's head, close enough that she felt the air displacement. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the empty fields. "I said, get off the bike," the man repeated, his voice cold and menacing. The young woman remained frozen in place. Her hands gripped the handlebars of her bicycle so tightly her knuckles were white. The man fired again. This time the bullet hit the ground near her feet, kicking up dirt and gravel. "You're next," he said, raising the gun to point directly at her chest. Just then, as if by divine intervention, a car appeared on the road behind them. The driver was heading in their direction, probably a farmer coming home from town or someone running errands on a Saturday afternoon. The motorcyclist turned his head toward the sound of the approaching car. In that split second of distraction, the young woman made her move. She pushed down hard on her pedals and took off, riding faster than she had ever ridden in her life, her legs pumping furiously as she put distance between herself and the armed man. She expected to hear another gunshot, expected to feel the impact of a bullet in her back, but the shot never came. Maybe the presence of the other car deterred the man from firing again. Maybe he decided chasing her wasn't worth the risk of being seen and identified. The young woman rode until she saw a pickup truck parked in a driveway. She practically threw herself off her bike and ran to the door of the house, pounding on it frantically. A man answered, and she gasped out what had just happened. The homeowner immediately called the police, while his wife brought the terrified young woman inside and gave her water. When police arrived, the young woman provided a detailed description of her attacker. White male, late 20s or early 30s, wearing a blue motorcycle helmet and tinted glasses. His motorcycle was distinctive, with a black top case mounted on the rear. The description was specific enough that police had a pretty good idea of who they were looking for. By the end of the day, they had detained a suspect. When the young woman was brought in to view a lineup, she identified her attacker immediately and without hesitation. It was Dennis Bowman. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The victim's identification, the description of the motorcycle that matched his vehicle, and the pattern of behavior that aligned with his previous offense. Dennis was charged with assault with intent to commit criminal sexual conduct and assault with a dangerous weapon. This time, there would be no plea deal that let him walk free. Dennis was convicted and sentenced to serve 5 to 10 years in prison. As part of his sentencing, Dennis underwent psychological evaluation. The psychologist who examined him concluded that Dennis posed a significant danger to women and would likely reoffend if released. The judge took this assessment seriously and made it part of the official court record. Dennis served the minimum sentence of 5 years and was released in 1985. He returned to his home in Holland, to his wife Brenda, and to his 10-year-old adopted daughter Andrea. The community knew about his conviction. It was a matter of public record. The church knew about it, and yet Dennis and Brenda remained active members of their congregation. They continued to teach Sunday school. They continued to participate in church activities. When people asked Brenda how she could stay married to a man who had committed such crimes, her answer was always the same. She forgave him. She took her marriage vows seriously. Everyone makes mistakes, and Dennis had served his time and deserved a second chance. But the file in Kathy's hands showed that Dennis's pattern of predatory behavior did not end with his release from prison. The documents continued into the 1990s, revealing more incidents that painted a picture of a man who was not just a violent offender, but an escalating danger. In 1998, 9 years after Andrea's disappearance, Dennis Bowman's name appeared in police records once again. A 28-year-old woman named Vicki Vandenbrink lived in a mobile home in Dorr, Michigan, a small community about 20 minutes from where the Bowmans had relocated. Vicki lived alone and had been experiencing a series of break-ins at her home that terrified her. Someone was getting into her trailer when she wasn't home. Things would be moved, items would go missing. Sometimes she would come home and just have an overwhelming feeling that someone had been there, even if she couldn't immediately identify what was different. The break-ins became so frequent and so distressing that Vicki contacted the Allegan County Sheriff's Department and begged for help. The Sheriff's Department, taking her concerns seriously, installed a security system in her mobile home that would alert them if there was an unauthorized entry. One evening, the alarm was triggered. A state trooper responded immediately to the call and arrived at Vicki's trailer within minutes. As he pulled up, he saw a man walking away from the back door of the mobile home. The trooper stopped the man and asked for identification. The man was Dennis Bowman. When questioned about what he was doing at Vicky's home, Dennis had a ready explanation. He claimed that he was temporarily staying with Vicky, who was a former co-worker from a manufacturing plant where they had both worked. He made it sound like this was a casual arrangement, as if he had every right to be there. The trooper, not having any reason to immediately disbelieve this explanation, took Dennis's information and allowed him to leave. However, following protocol, the trooper contacted Vicky herself to verify Dennis's story. Vicky was not home at the time, but when she received the message from the sheriff's department and called back, her response was immediate and alarmed. No, Dennis was not staying with her. No, she had not given him permission to be in her home. Dennis was lying. The trooper immediately went back to locate Dennis. When confronted with Vicky's statement contradicting his story, Dennis changed his explanation. He now claimed that he had only entered the trailer to use the bathroom. He said he had been in the area and needed to use a restroom, and he remembered that Vicky lived there from when his daughter Vanessa had wanted to sell Girl Scout cookies in the neighborhood. This new story was just as flimsy as the first, and the trooper wasn't buying it. With Vicky's permission and cooperation, police obtained a search warrant for Dennis's property. The search of Dennis's home and outbuildings revealed something chilling. Hidden in the loft of a shed behind the main house, investigators found a black duffel bag. Inside were items that painted a disturbing picture of Dennis's activities. The bag contained multiple pieces of women's lingerie, all belonging to Vicky Vandenbrink. There was also a short-barreled shotgun, a black sweatshirt, and a ski mask. When confronted with this evidence, Dennis finally admitted the truth. He confessed that he had become obsessed with Vicky. He admitted to breaking into her trailer multiple times to steal intimate items of her clothing. He confessed to cutting a slit in her curtains so he could peek through and watch her when she was home. He admitted to stalking her. Dennis was arrested and charged with breaking and entering with intent to commit larceny. The psychological evaluation from his earlier conviction, the one that said he posed a danger to women, had proven prophetic. Before his sentencing, Dennis wrote a letter to the judge. In the letter, he presented himself as a good man who had made a mistake. He described himself as a devoted father of 2 daughters, aged 25 and 11. He talked about his community service at his Catholic church. He included character references from friends and congregation members who vouched for his good character. What Dennis deliberately omitted from his letter was the fact that one of those 2 daughters he referenced, the one who was supposedly 25 years old, had been missing and unseen for 10 years. Andrea had disappeared in 1989. It was now 1998. Dennis was lying to the court about having 2 daughters, using Andrea as evidence of his parental devotion, while knowing full well that she was not alive to contradict him. The character references he submitted were from people who genuinely believed Dennis was a good man. They didn't know about his criminal history. They didn't know about the violence and stalking. They only knew the face he presented at church, the helpful volunteer who showed up for charity drives and smiled politely at Sunday services. One of the most detailed character references came from Father Michael O'Connell, a priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Allegan County, where Dennis frequently volunteered his time. Father O'Connell wrote a passionate letter to the district attorney, praising Dennis Bowman's exemplary character and his significant contributions to the church's charitable work. The priest argued that sending such a dedicated community member to prison would be a grave disservice not only to Dennis and his family, but to the church and the wider community that benefited from his service. The letter painted Dennis as a man of deep faith who had momentarily strayed but deserved compassion and a second chance. Father O'Connell, like the others who wrote on Dennis's behalf, had no idea who they were really defending. They didn't know about the home invasion and sexual assault in 79. They didn't know about the attempted abduction at gunpoint in 80. They didn't know about the missing daughter whose disappearance Dennis had reported but never seemed particularly bothered by. The judge, presented with these glowing character references and Dennis's own self-serving letter, imposed a relatively lenient sentence. Dennis was given 1 year in jail and 5 years of probation. He served his time and returned once again to his family and his community. His pattern of predatory behavior unbroken, his secret still buried. As Kathy read through the documents detailing Dennis Bowman's criminal history, one document in particular stood out as the most heartbreaking of all. It was a report filed in November 1988. just 4 months before Andrea disappeared. The report documented an allegation made by Andrea Bowman, then 14 years old, to a teacher at her school. Andrea had confided in this teacher that she was afraid to go home because her father was abusing her. The teacher, following mandatory reporting laws, immediately notified the school administration, who contacted Child Protective Services. A social worker was assigned to investigate the allegation. The social worker went to the Bowman residence to interview the family. The report included notes from that visit, and reading them, Kathy felt a rage building inside her that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. When confronted with Andrea's allegation, Dennis and Brenda had provided an explanation that the social worker accepted without further investigation. They said that Andrea had recently learned she was adopted and was very upset about this revelation. They suggested that Andrea was acting out emotionally, fabricating stories about abuse as a way of expressing her anger at them for not being her biological parents. They portrayed Andrea as a troubled, rebellious teenager whose allegations couldn't be trusted. The social worker's notes indicated that she found the Bowmans' explanation credible. She noted that they seemed like concerned parents who were dealing with a difficult adolescent situation. She described their home as clean and well-maintained. She observed that baby Vanessa appeared healthy and well cared for. The conclusion of the report was that the allegation was unfounded, meaning there was not sufficient evidence to support Andrea's claim of abuse. The recommendation was that no further action be taken. Andrea was left in the home. The police had been notified of the report, as was standard protocol, but they too accepted the explanation that this was teenage rebellion rather than genuine abuse. The report was filed away, and life in the Bowman household continued as before. Except now Dennis knew that Andrea had tried to tell someone what was happening. He knew she had reached out for help. He knew she had tried to expose him. And 4 months later, Andrea vanished. Reading this document, Kathy understood with terrible clarity what had actually happened. Her daughter had been crying out for help. She had done exactly what children are told to do, she told a trusted adult. And the system had failed her completely. The social worker had been fooled by Dennis and Brenda's performance of concerned parenting. The police had been too quick to accept the convenient explanation of teenage rebellion. No one had pushed harder, asked more questions, or insisted on a follow-up visit. Andrea had been abandoned by the very system that was supposed to protect children. Kathy thought about those 4 months between the failed intervention and Andrea's disappearance. What must those months have been like for Andrea? Living in a house with a man she had accused of abuse, knowing that no one had believed her, knowing that no help was coming, feeling utterly trapped and hopeless. At 14 years old, Andrea must have felt that she had exhausted all her options. She had told a teacher, and nothing changed. She was stuck caring for a baby sister in a home where her adoptive father was abusing her, and her adoptive mother was either oblivious or unwilling to acknowledge what was happening. By the time Kathy finished reading through all the documents in Dennis Bowman's criminal file, her entire understanding of what happened to Andrea had shifted fundamentally. When she first received the letter from Michigan State Police suggesting Andrea might be the Racine County Jane Doe, Kathy had accepted the runaway theory, at least partially. It made sense that a troubled teenager might run away from a strict home and end up in Wisconsin, especially if she was looking for her biological mother or trying to escape a difficult situation. But now, knowing what Dennis Bowman was capable of, knowing his history of violence toward women, knowing that Andrea had reported abuse just months before she disappeared, Kathy no longer believed the runaway story. She didn't believe Andrea had lived for 10 years as a runaway before dying in Wisconsin. That scenario relied on Andrea successfully leaving Holland, surviving on her own for a decade, and then ending up dead in Racine County. It was possible, but it seemed increasingly unlikely. The more probable scenario, the one that Kathy's maternal instincts and the evidence both supported, was that Andrea had never left Holland at all, that something terrible had happened to her the night of March 11th, '89, that Dennis was responsible, and that Andrea's body had been somewhere in Ottawa County all along. But where? Kathy began obsessing over this question. She spent hours online researching the Bowman family's movements after Andrea's disappearance. She learned that they had moved from the farmhouse on Lincoln Road to a new residence in Hamilton on 134th Avenue, shortly after Andrea vanished. Using Google Earth, Kathy began studying satellite imagery of both properties. She zoomed in as close as the resolution would allow. She studied the yards, looking for any signs of disturbed earth or unusual features. And at the Hamilton property on 134th Avenue, she saw something that caught her attention. In the backyard, there was a patch of earth that looked different from the surrounding area. The grass there seemed less established. The ground appeared slightly raised or disturbed. Kathy became convinced that this was where Andrea was buried. She believed that Dennis had killed Andrea at the farmhouse on Lincoln Road and initially buried her there. Then when the family moved to Hamilton, he had exhumed her remains and reburied them at the new property so he could keep control over the evidence. It sounded like an extreme measure, but Kathy thought about the psychology of someone like Dennis. He was a control freak. He was meticulous. He had spent years keeping secrets and maintaining a double life. It was entirely plausible that he would go to such lengths to ensure that Andrea's body remained under his control. Kathy contacted the Michigan State Police and begged them to search the property on 134th Avenue. She explained her theory. She sent them screenshots from Google Earth showing the disturbed patch of earth. She pleaded with them to get a search warrant and dig. But the police explained that they couldn't obtain a search warrant based on satellite imagery and maternal intuition. They needed probable cause, hard evidence that would convince a judge that a search was justified. Kathy's theory, no matter how compelling she found it, was not enough. Carl Koppelman, the cold case researcher who had first connected Andrea's case to the Racine County Jane Doe, disagreed with Kathy's theory about the Hamilton property. Carl applied his knowledge of criminal profiling and told Kathy that killers almost never take the risk of digging up a body and moving it to a new location. Exhuming a body is an incredibly risky operation. There's the physical challenge of digging up remains that have been decomposing underground. There's the risk of being seen by neighbors or witnesses. There's the danger of leaving new forensic evidence at both the original burial site and the new one. Most importantly, there's the psychological difficulty of handling a corpse, especially one that has been dead for months or years. Carl argued that if Dennis had killed Andrea and buried her, the most likely location was somewhere near the original farmhouse on Lincoln Road. That was where she had disappeared from. That was where Dennis would have had privacy and familiarity with the property. That was where the body would have remained unless there was a compelling reason to move it. But without evidence to support either theory, without a search warrant, and without the cooperation of the Bowman family, the investigation remained stuck. Kathy was not Andrea's legal mother anymore. The adoption had severed all legal ties. In the eyes of the law, Kathy had no standing to demand anything regarding Andrea's case. She couldn't force the police to search. She couldn't compel Dennis and Brenda to cooperate. She was powerless. All she could do was wait for the DNA results that would tell her whether Andrea was the Racine County Jane Doe, and hope that somehow, some way, the truth would eventually come out. In September 2013, Kathy Turkanian attended an event that would bring her face-to-face with the family who had raised her daughter. The Missing in Michigan Conference was an annual gathering organized to generate leads and maintain public awareness of unsolved missing persons cases throughout the state. Families of the missing would set up tables with photographs and information about their loved ones. Law enforcement would attend to discuss their ongoing investigations. Cold case researchers and volunteers would network and share information. Kathy decided to attend the conference that year. She had been fighting for answers about Andrea for 3 years at this point, ever since receiving that first letter from the Michigan State Police. The DNA results had come back months earlier with the answer she had both hoped for and dreaded. Kathy was not biologically related to the Racine County Jane Doe. Andrea was not the Wisconsin victim. This meant that the theory Carl Koppelman had initially proposed was wrong, but it also meant something more disturbing. If Andrea wasn't the Jane Doe who had been found in Wisconsin in '99, then where was Andrea? If she had lived for 10 years after her disappearance, why had she never been found? Why had no credible sightings come in despite her face appearing on MTV in the Runaway Train video? The failed DNA match actually strengthened Kathy's conviction that Dennis had killed Andrea shortly after her disappearance and hidden her body somewhere in Michigan. But proving that was another matter entirely. Kathy contacted Carl Koppelman before the conference, and together they had custom T-shirts made. The shirts were simple but striking, white with bold black text that read, "Find Andrea Bowman," along with the year of her disappearance and a contact number for tips. When Kathy arrived at the conference venue and began setting up her table with photographs of Andrea and information about the case, Carl arrived and joined her. They wore their matching shirts and began talking to people who stopped by to learn about Andrea's story. At some point during the day, Carl was scanning the room when he spotted two familiar faces across the hall. He touched Kathy's arm and nodded in their direction. "That's Vanessa," he said quietly, indicating a young woman with reddish hair who appeared to be in her mid-20s. "And that's Brenda." Kathy's heart began to pound. She stared at the heavy-set woman with the curled bangs who had raised her daughter. This was the person who had cared for Alexis Andrea from infancy through age 14. This was the woman who had been in the house the night Andrea disappeared. This was Dennis Bowman's wife. Brenda had noticed them too. She had seen the "Find Andrea Bowman" shirts. She had recognized Carl Koppelman from online forums and Facebook, where discussions about Andrea's case had taken place. And she knew who Kathy was from those same online discussions. Brenda approached their table with Vanessa beside her. The tension in the air was palpable. Here was the biological mother who had given Andrea up, and here was the adoptive mother who had raised her. Two women who had both lost the same girl, but who had very different theories about what had happened. "I know who you are," Brenda said to Kathy. Her tone was not friendly, but it wasn't openly hostile either. It was guarded, defensive. "I'm Andrea's mother," Kathy replied. She knew this was technically not true in a legal sense, but emotionally she had never stopped being Andrea's mother. Brenda bristled at this. "I raised her. I was her mother for 14 years. The conversation that followed was tense and painful. Brenda told Kathy that she and Dennis had cooperated fully with the police investigation in 1989. To prove this, she had brought a 3-ring binder filled with photocopies of missing person flyers, notes from searches she had conducted, and documentation of tips she had reported to police. She presented the binder to Kathy almost like evidence in a trial, proof that she had done everything a mother should do when her child goes missing. She had searched. She had followed up on leads. She had never given up hope that Andrea would come home. But when Carl Koppelman gently raised the subject of Dennis's criminal history, the things that Kathy had learned from the Freedom of Information Act request, Brenda's defenses went up immediately. "I know what Dennis did," Brenda said, her voice tight. "I haven't forgotten, but I forgive him. I take my marriage vows very seriously, for better or worse, in good times and bad. I made a commitment to Dennis before God, and I don't break my commitments." Kathy stared at this woman in disbelief. Brenda knew about the home invasion and sexual assault. She knew about the attempted abduction at gunpoint. She knew about the stalking, and she had chosen to stay married to him. She had chosen to keep him in the same house with their daughter, the biological daughter born in '88, and with Andrea, the adopted daughter who had later accused him of abuse. "He hurt women," Kathy said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's dangerous. Don't you think it's possible he hurt Andrea?" Brenda shook her head firmly. Dennis would never hurt Andrea. She was his daughter. He loved her. She ran away because she was upset about being adopted and because she and I fought about her responsibilities around the house. It had nothing to do with Dennis. The certainty in Brenda's voice was chilling. She had constructed a narrative that protected her husband and allowed her to maintain her marriage and her identity as a faithful wife. Andrea's disappearance was explained away as teenage rebellion. Dennis's criminal history was acknowledged but forgiven and deemed irrelevant to Andrea's case. There was no getting through to her. Brenda's loyalty to Dennis was absolute, and no amount of evidence or logic was going to shake it. The encounter left Kathy feeling hopeless. If Brenda wouldn't cooperate with the investigation, if she was actively defending Dennis and maintaining that he had nothing to do with Andrea's disappearance, then how would justice ever be served? The investigation in Michigan remained stalled. Dennis continued to live as a free man, protected by his wife's unwavering support and the lack of physical evidence linking him to Andrea's disappearance. But unknown to everyone at that conference, events were already in motion 700 miles away that would finally bring Dennis Bowman's decades of violence into the light. In Norfolk, Virginia, there was a murder case that had remained unsolved for nearly 40 years. The victim was Kathleen O'Brien Doyle, and her death in 1980 had been one of the most brutal and disturbing cases in the city's history. Kathleen was 25 years old in September 1980. She had recently married her husband, Stephen, a Navy pilot who was stationed in Norfolk. They had been married for only 5 months when Stephen received deployment orders. He shipped out aboard the U.S. Eisenhower, leaving Kathleen alone in their small rental home with just her orange tabby cat for company. Being a Navy wife came with challenges, and extended separations were part of the deal. Kathleen was accustomed to spending time alone, keeping herself busy with work and friendships while Stephen was at sea. But in September of that year, something went terribly wrong. Friends began to notice that they hadn't seen or heard from Kathleen in several days. Phone calls went unanswered. She didn't show up for plans they had made. Concerned, a group of friends went to her house to check on her. When they arrived, they found the front door locked. They knocked and called out, but there was no response. A sense of dread building. They tried the back door and found it unlocked. They pushed it open and called Kathleen's name as they entered. The scene they discovered inside was a nightmare. Kathleen was lying dead in her bedroom. The room had been ransacked, with drawers pulled open and contents scattered across the floor. Kathleen's body showed evidence of a violent, prolonged attack. The friends who found her immediately called the police. When investigators arrived and processed the scene, the medical examiner was summoned to document the injuries and determine the cause of death. The autopsy revealed the sadistic nature of the killer. Kathleen had been strangled with a rope. She had been stabbed multiple times all over her body, including defensive wounds on her hands where she had tried to fight off her attacker. She had been sexually assaulted. There was even a burn mark on her face, suggesting the killer had tortured her before finally ending her life. The medical examiner determined that the time of death was somewhere between 7:30 in the evening and midnight on September 10th, 1980. Kathleen's body had lain undiscovered in the bedroom until noon on September 11th, when her friends found her. The investigation moved quickly at first. Police collected evidence from the scene, including biological material left by the attacker. They interviewed neighbors to see if anyone had seen or heard anything suspicious. They looked into Kathleen's background to see if there were any obvious suspects, angry ex-boyfriends or enemies who might have wanted to harm her. But despite their efforts, the case stalled. There were no witnesses who had seen anyone entering or leaving the house around the time of the murder. There was no obvious suspect with a motive to kill Kathleen. The physical evidence collected from the scene was limited by the forensic technology available in 1980. DNA analysis existed in only the most rudimentary form in 1980. The DNA that would eventually revolutionize criminal investigations was still years away from being a standard tool in law enforcement. The biological evidence collected from Kathleen's bedroom was preserved and stored in the evidence room, but there was no way to analyze it in any meaningful way at the time. The case went cold. Kathleen's murder joined the ranks of thousands of unsolved homicides across America, a tragedy that haunted her family and the investigators who had worked the case, but which seemed destined to remain a mystery. Then in 1984, 4 years after Kathleen's death, something unexpected happened. A man named Henry Lee Lucas was arrested in Texas and charged with multiple murders. Lucas was a drifter with a long criminal history, and while in custody, he began confessing to murders all across the country. Hundreds of murders. Lucas claimed he had been a serial killer for years, traveling from state to state, leaving bodies in his wake. Law enforcement agencies around the country sent investigators to interview Lucas in his Texas jail cell to see if he could provide information about their unsolved cases. Lucas seemed to know details about crimes that had never been publicly released, lending credibility to his confessions. When Lucas mentioned the name Kathleen Doyle among the hundreds of women he claimed to have killed, Norfolk Police Department detectives flew to Texas to interview him personally. Lucas told them he had been in Norfolk with his accomplice, a man named Otis Toole, in September of '80. He described the attack on Kathleen in terms that seemed to match the evidence from the scene. Investigators were convinced they had finally solved the case. But then, just as suddenly as he had confessed, Lucas recanted. He admitted that he had made everything up. He told police that he had been lying about most of the murders he'd confessed to, and he'd done it simply to make law enforcement look foolish. He laughed at the detectives who had flown hundreds of miles to interview him. The Norfolk case fell apart. Without Lucas's confession, and without any other evidence linking him or Toole to the crime scene, there was no basis for charges. The case went cold again. The DNA collected from Kathleen's bedroom remained in storage at the Norfolk Police Department evidence room for nearly 4 decades, a silent witness waiting for technology to catch up with justice. In 2018, the landscape of cold case investigations changed dramatically with the arrest of the Golden State Killer, using a revolutionary technique called genetic genealogy. Investigators had taken DNA from crime scenes attributed to the unidentified serial killer and rapist and uploaded it to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch. These databases allowed anyone to upload their DNA data and search for genetic relatives. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated that even if a perpetrator's DNA wasn't in the database, the DNA of their distant cousins might be. By building family trees and narrowing down the possibilities, investigators could identify suspects who had previously been completely unknown to them. The success of the Golden State Killer case sparked a revolution in cold case investigations across America. Police departments began reviewing their oldest unsolved cases to see if they had DNA evidence that could be run through genetic genealogy. The Norfolk Cold Case Unit, led by Detective Jonathan Smith, decided to take another look at the Kathleen Doyle case. They had excellent DNA evidence from the bedsheet collected at the scene in 1980. They sent the sample to a genetic genealogy company for analysis. The process took approximately 1 year. The genealogy company had to extract the DNA, process it, upload it to genealogical databases, and then begin the painstaking work of building family trees from the genetic matches that appeared. In 2019, Detective Smith received the results. The genealogy analysis had produced a list of 32 names. These were not direct matches to the perpetrator, but rather distant relatives who shared some percentage of DNA with the person who had left biological evidence at Kathleen Doyle's murder scene. The detective and a team of genetic genealogists began the process of building family trees for each of these 32 individuals, tracing back generations to find common ancestors, then working forward to identify every living descendant who could theoretically be the unknown subject. After months of work, the family trees began to converge on a specific branch of a specific family. And at the center of that genealogical web was a name that meant nothing to the Virginia authorities, but everything to investigators in Michigan: Dennis Lee Bowman. Detective Smith had never heard of Dennis Bowman. He had no idea about the missing daughter in Holland or the criminal history in Michigan. The name was just a data point, a potential suspect generated by genetic genealogy. But Smith was a thorough investigator. Before pursuing the lead any further, he began doing background research on Dennis Bowman. He ran his name through criminal databases. He searched for news articles and public records. What he found alarmed him immediately. Dennis Bowman had been convicted of attempted abduction and assault with a dangerous weapon in Michigan in 1980, just months before Kathleen Doyle was murdered in Norfolk. The victim had been a 19-year-old woman on a bicycle who Dennis had forced off the road at gunpoint and ordered into the woods. The similarity to what had happened to Kathleen was striking. Both were attacks on young women. Both involved extreme violence or the threat of it. Both had a sexual component. Detective Smith also discovered that Dennis Bowman's adopted daughter had disappeared under suspicious circumstances in 1989 and had never been found. This raised even more red flags. A missing daughter, a violent criminal history, and now a genetic link to a brutal murder in Virginia. The pieces were starting to form a picture. Smith reached out to the Michigan State Police to learn more about Dennis Bowman. He connected with a detective sergeant who was familiar with the Andrea Bowman case and with Dennis's history. When Smith asked the Michigan detective what he thought about Dennis being a suspect in a 1980 murder in Virginia, the response was immediate and unequivocal. "I'll tell you, John, I know Dennis and I know his family. He's probably your guy." Encouraged by this assessment, Smith dug deeper into Dennis's background. He contacted the Grand Rapids Police Department in Michigan and requested old court records from Dennis's 1980 conviction. The court transcript provided the critical link Smith needed. It confirmed that Dennis Bowman had been on active duty with the Navy Reserves in September 1980. Specifically, he had been assigned to a 2-week training drill in Norfolk, Virginia, during the exact time frame when Kathleen Doyle was murdered. Dennis had been in Norfolk. He had been in the same city at the same time when the murder occurred, and his DNA was a match to the evidence from the scene. Detective Smith now had enough to make an arrest, but he needed one more thing: a confirmed DNA sample directly from Dennis Bowman to eliminate any possibility of a mix-up or error in the genealogical analysis. Smith contacted the Allegan County Sheriff's Office in Michigan and explained the situation. They needed to get a DNA sample from Dennis without him knowing why they wanted it. If Dennis suspected he was being investigated for murder, he might flee or destroy evidence. The Michigan investigators began planning a covert operation to obtain Dennis's DNA. The plan was to conduct surveillance on him and wait for an opportunity to collect something he discarded: a coffee cup, a cigarette butt, anything with his saliva or skin cells that could be tested. But before they could put that plan into action, Dennis Bowman walked right into their hands. In November 2019, Dennis and Brenda Bowman arrived at the Allegan County Sheriff's Office to file a formal complaint. They were there because they wanted to report harassment. Specifically, they were angry about Kathy Turkanian's online activities and her public statements about Dennis. For years, Kathy had been posting on social media and true crime forums about her belief that Dennis was responsible for Andrea's disappearance. She had shared the details of his criminal history. She had called him a predator and a likely murderer. She had even created a Facebook page dedicated to finding Andrea, where she regularly posted updates and theories, many of which directly accused Dennis of killing her daughter. Dennis and Brenda felt that this constituted defamation and harassment. They wanted the sheriff's office to do something about it, to make Kathy stop posting these lies about Dennis online. When Dennis and Brenda arrived at the sheriff's office, investigators who were already aware of the Norfolk case and the need to obtain Dennis's DNA saw an incredible opportunity falling into their laps. The detectives invited Dennis and Brenda into an interview room to discuss their complaint. They listened sympathetically as the couple explained their grievances against Kathy. They took notes and asked clarifying questions, projecting an image of taking the complaint seriously. During the meeting, one of the investigators offered Dennis a bottle of water. It was a casual gesture, the kind of hospitality that might be extended to anyone sitting in an interview room for an extended conversation. Dennis accepted the water bottle. He drank from it during the interview, unscrewing the cap and tilting it back to take several swallows as he talked about how Kathy's accusations were ruining his reputation and causing him emotional distress. The interview lasted about an hour. At the end, the investigators assured Dennis and Brenda that they would look into the matter and see what could be done about the harassment complaint. Dennis and Brenda seemed satisfied with this response. They stood up, shook hands with the investigators, and left the building. The moment they were gone, the investigators sprang into action. The water bottle Dennis had drunk from was carefully retrieved, wearing gloves to avoid contaminating it. It was sealed in an evidence bag, labeled, and immediately sent to the forensic laboratory for DNA testing. Now it was a waiting game. The DNA analysis would take several weeks. The sample from the water bottle would be compared to the DNA from the bedsheet in Kathleen Doyle's case to see if they matched. While they waited for results, investigators prepared for both possible outcomes. If the DNA was not a match, the case would go back to square one, looking for other suspects from the genetic genealogy family trees. If the DNA was a match, they would move forward with arrest warrants and begin building the case for prosecution. In December 2019, the results came back from the lab. The DNA from Dennis Bowman's water bottle was a match to the biological material recovered from Kathleen Doyle's bedroom in 1980. The match was definitive, with odds of it being a coincidence so astronomical that they were effectively impossible. Dennis Bowman was Kathleen Doyle's killer. Detective Smith and his colleagues in Norfolk began coordinating with law enforcement in Michigan to plan the arrest. They needed to move carefully. Dennis was now 70 years old, but his history showed him to be dangerous. He had access to firearms based on previous records. They couldn't take any chances that he might resist arrest or harm someone. The arrest was planned for late November, just before the Thanksgiving holiday. A team of officers from multiple jurisdictions would execute the arrest warrant at Dennis's home in Michigan. Then he would be transported to Virginia for extradition to face murder charges. On November 21st, 2019, law enforcement descended on the Bowman residence on 134th Avenue in Hamilton, Michigan. The morning of November 21st, 2019, was cold and gray in Hamilton, Michigan. The kind of late autumn day where the sky hangs low and heavy, threatening snow that hasn't quite decided to fall yet. Inside the Bowman home on 134th Avenue, Dennis and Brenda were going about their normal Thursday routine. Dennis, now 70 years old with thinning hair and a stooped posture that came with age, was probably reading the newspaper or watching television. Brenda, 64 and still devoted to the man she had married 4 decades earlier, might have been preparing lunch or doing household chores. Their daughter Vanessa, now 31 years old, did not live with them anymore. She had her own life, though she remained close to her parents and visited regularly. The knock on the door was loud and authoritative, the kind of knock that immediately signals official business. Dennis went to answer it, perhaps thinking it was a delivery or a neighbor with a question. When he opened the door, he found himself face to face with multiple law enforcement officers, some in uniform, some in plain clothes, all wearing serious expressions. "Dennis Lee Bowman?" one of the officers asked, though they clearly already knew who he was. "Yes," Dennis replied, his voice uncertain. "You're under arrest for the murder of Kathleen O'Brien Doyle." The officer held up the warrant as he spoke the Miranda rights that Dennis had heard before during his previous arrests. "You have the right to remain silent." Brenda appeared behind Dennis, drawn by the commotion at the door. When she saw the police, when she heard the words murder and Kathleen O'Brien Doyle, her face went pale. "What?" she said, her voice rising in pitch. "What are you talking about? Who is Kathleen O'Brien Doyle?" The officers explained briefly that Kathleen Doyle had been murdered in Norfolk, Virginia in 1980, and that DNA evidence had linked Dennis to the crime. Brenda's reaction was immediate and vehement. She refused to believe it. She stepped between the officers and Dennis, her hands raised as if she could physically block them from taking her husband. "No," she said firmly. "You've made a mistake. Dennis wasn't in Norfolk in 1980. He was here in Michigan. He was with me. This is impossible." One of the officers gently tried to move Brenda aside so they could handcuff Dennis. When he touched her arm, she slapped his hand away. "Get away from him," she shouted. "He didn't kill anyone. Dennis wouldn't do that. He's a good man. He volunteers at church. He helps people. You don't understand." Her voice was breaking into sobs now, panic and disbelief overwhelming her. "Dennis, tell them. Tell them you weren't in Virginia. Tell them this is all a mistake." But Dennis said nothing. He stood there passive, allowing the officers to turn him around and place his hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "I'll call a lawyer," Brenda said, tears streaming down her face now. "I'll get you out of this, Dennis. I'll find the best lawyer we can afford. This is all a mistake. It has to be a mistake." As the officers began walking Dennis toward their vehicle, Brenda called after him, "Dennis, I love you. I believe you. I know you didn't do this." Dennis was placed in the back of the police car and driven away from the home he had shared with Brenda for 3 decades. The home where, unknown to the officers at that moment, the body of his adopted daughter lay buried in the backyard. Dennis Bowman was transported to the Allegan County Sheriff's Office rather than being immediately extradited to Virginia. The reason was strategic. Investigators from both Michigan and Virginia wanted a chance to interrogate him while he was in a controlled environment before the formal extradition process began. Detective Jonathan Smith flew to Michigan specifically for this interrogation. He had been working the Kathleen Doyle case for years, and now he finally had the suspect who had eluded justice for nearly 4 decades. But Smith wanted more than just the confession to Kathleen's murder. He wanted the truth about Andrea Bowman as well. The interrogation took place in a small room with concrete block walls painted a institutional beige. A metal table was bolted to the floor with 2 chairs on either side. A camera mounted in the corner recorded everything. Detective Smith entered the room and sat down across from Dennis. For a long moment, the 2 men simply looked at each other. Dennis with his wire-rimmed glasses and thinning hair, Smith with the patient expression of an investigator who had all the time in the world. "Dennis, I want to explain something to you before we start," Smith said, his tone conversational and calm. "I'm not here to yell at you or threaten you or play games. I want the truth. That's all. Just the truth." To emphasize this point, Smith did something unusual. He removed his detective's badge from his belt and placed it on the table between them. "See? No badge. We're just two people having a conversation. I want to understand what happened, and I think you want to explain it. So let's talk. This psychological approach, removing the badge to make the interaction seem less formal and adversarial, was a deliberate tactic. Smith was trying to build rapport to make Dennis feel comfortable enough to open up, and remarkably, it worked. Dennis, perhaps relieved that someone finally wanted to hear his version of events, perhaps tired of carrying secrets for decades, began to talk. At first, he talked about his childhood, about his difficult relationship with his parents, about feeling misunderstood and isolated growing up. Then he talked about his fascination with knives and bladed weapons. He described it as something that had been with him since adolescence, an interest that he knew other people found strange, but that he couldn't shake. As the conversation continued and Dennis seemed to relax, Smith gradually steered the discussion towards September 1980 and Norfolk, Virginia. You were there for training, right? With the Navy Reserves? Dennis nodded. Yes, it was supposed to be a 2-week drill. And you were alone, away from Brenda, away from everyone you knew. Yes, that must have been stressful. Dennis agreed that it had been stressful. He talked about feeling isolated and anxious. Then, with Smith's gentle prompting, he began to describe the night of Kathleen Doyle's murder. He said he had been drinking heavily. He left the Navy base because he needed to clear his head. He wandered through residential neighborhoods in Norfolk, disoriented and drunk, until he spotted a house that appeared empty. No lights on, no car in the driveway. He decided to break in to steal money. According to Dennis's account, he entered through an unlocked door and began searching the rooms for cash or valuables. He claimed that he stumbled into a bedroom and was startled when he realized someone was in the bed. Kathleen woke up and started screaming. Dennis said he panicked. He grabbed her to try to quiet her, covering her mouth with his left hand. His right hand, he claimed, happened to be holding a pocket knife. She grabbed at me, Dennis said, his voice flat and emotionless. She was trying to push me away. And when she did that, she grabbed my hand, the one with the knife, and it went into her. Smith listened without interrupting, letting Dennis spin his carefully constructed narrative. But the detective knew from the autopsy report that this version of events was a sanitized lie. Kathleen had been stabbed multiple times all over her body. She had been strangled. She had been sexually assaulted. The attack had been prolonged and sadistic. Dennis's story made it sound like an accident, a tragic result of panic and bad luck rather than a deliberate act of violence. He was attempting to minimize his responsibility even in confession. What happened after she was stabbed? Smith asked. I left, Dennis said. I told her I was leaving, and I left. She was still moving when I went out the door. Again, a lie. Kathleen had been strangled to death. The stab wound Dennis claimed was accidental couldn't have been the cause of death. Smith pressed gently. Dennis, the medical examiner's report shows some things that don't quite match what you're describing. Kathleen had injuries that suggest the attack went on for longer than just a few moments. Dennis's face hardened. He shook his head. I don't remember all of it. I was drunk. It's all very fuzzy. Do you remember strangling her with a cord? No. Do you remember the burn mark on her face? No. Do you remember sexually assaulting her? Dennis's voice rose slightly. I don't remember any of that. I remember the knife going into her by accident, and I remember leaving. Smith tried a different approach. Dennis, when you were committing this act, what were you feeling? Dennis went silent for a long moment. Then he said something that chilled Smith to the core. It wasn't me, Dennis said. There was something else. A demon. It took me over. Smith kept his expression neutral. A demon? Yes, it wanted to get out. It made me do things. Dennis reached for a notepad on the table and picked up a pen. He began drawing, his hand moving quickly across the paper. When he turned the notepad around to show Smith, the detective saw a crude sketch of a creature with horns and a pointed beard, something that looked like a stereotypical depiction of the devil. This, Dennis said, tapping the drawing, this is what was inside me. Smith recognized this for what it was, a psychological deflection. By claiming a demon had made him commit the murder, Dennis was attempting to avoid full responsibility for his actions. He wasn't in control. He was possessed. Therefore, the real Dennis Bowman, the good man who volunteered at church and raised 2 daughters, couldn't be held accountable for what the demon did. But Smith didn't argue with Dennis about demons or possession. He simply noted Dennis's statement and moved on. "Dennis, I need to ask you about something else. About Andrea." At the mention of his daughter's name, Dennis's demeanor shifted. He became guarded, his body language closing off. "Andrea ran away," he said firmly. "I don't know where she is." "Dennis, we know that's not true. We know Andrea didn't run away." "She did. She took money in a suitcase and left." Smith leaned forward slightly. "Dennis, you just confessed to killing Kathleen Doyle. You told me about the demon. You've been honest with me about something you did 40 years ago. Don't you think it's time to be honest about Andrea too?" Dennis shook his head. "There's nothing to be honest about. She ran away." Smith tried different approaches for the next several hours. He appealed to Dennis's conscience. He pointed out that Andrea's biological mother had been searching for her for years and deserved to know the truth. He suggested that Dennis might feel relief if he finally told someone what really happened. But on the subject of Andrea, Dennis remained adamant. He had confessed to murder in Virginia, but he would not confess to anything regarding his missing daughter. Eventually, Smith left the room to let Dennis sit alone with his thoughts. The camera continued recording. During this time alone, Dennis was captured on camera muttering to himself. At first, his mantra was, "I didn't do it, I didn't do it." He repeated this over and over, like he was trying to convince himself. But then abruptly, the mantra changed. "I did it again, I did it again, I did it again." Dennis wasn't talking about Kathleen Doyle when he said this. The Kathleen Doyle murder was a one-time event in Virginia. "I did it again," suggested repetition, a pattern, multiple acts. The investigators watching the video feed knew immediately what Dennis was referring to. He had killed before, and the most obvious victim was Andrea Bowman. But even with this recorded admission, they still had no body, no physical evidence, and no confession that would hold up in court. Dennis's muttered words on camera could be interpreted in multiple ways and would likely be deemed inadmissible as evidence of Andrea's murder. They needed more. With Dennis Bowman arrested for Kathleen Doyle's murder, investigators in both Virginia and Michigan faced a strategic question. How could they leverage this arrest to finally solve the Andrea Bowman case? The Michigan investigators understood that once Dennis was extradited to Virginia to face murder charges, their window of opportunity would close. Virginia would take custody of him, try him, and almost certainly convict him based on the DNA evidence. He would be sentenced to life in prison in Virginia, and Michigan would lose its chance to find Andrea's body and bring closure to that case. They needed Dennis to cooperate now, while they still had leverage over him. But what leverage did they have? What did Dennis want that they could offer in exchange for the truth about Andrea? The answer came from understanding Dennis's psychology and priorities. Throughout his life, Dennis had shown himself to be a narcissist who craved control and proximity to his family. Even when he was convicted of crimes, he wanted to maintain his image as a devoted husband and father. His greatest fear, investigators surmised, was not prison itself, but rather permanent separation from Brenda and Vanessa. So they made him a proposal. If Dennis would reveal the location of Andrea's body, the state of Michigan would make arrangements for him to serve his sentence in a Michigan prison rather than being sent to Virginia immediately. This would mean that Brenda and Vanessa could visit him regularly. They could maintain contact. He wouldn't be cut off completely from his family. If he refused to cooperate, he would be extradited to Virginia immediately, and he would likely never see Brenda or Vanessa again, except perhaps for a brief visit or two if they were willing and able to travel across the country. Dennis initially resisted this offer. He continued to maintain that Andrea had run away, and he didn't know where she was. But as the reality of his situation sank in, as he realized that he was going to prison for the rest of his life one way or another, he began to waver. Finally, Dennis made a request. He wanted to speak to Brenda before making any decisions. He wanted to see her face to face. The investigators agreed to this, but they had a condition. The meeting would take place in the interrogation room with cameras recording every word. There would be no private conversation. Dennis agreed to these terms. He specifically asked the officers to make sure the cameras were recording, which investigators found interesting. Dennis wanted this conversation preserved. He wanted a record of what he was about to say to his wife. Brenda was contacted and asked to come to the sheriff's office. She was told that Dennis wanted to speak with her. She arrived quickly, her face showing the stress and lack of sleep of the past few days. She looked like a woman clinging to hope that all of this was somehow a terrible mistake that would be cleared up. She was brought into the interrogation room where Dennis waited. The door closed behind her, but the camera in the corner continued recording. "Dennis?" Brenda said, her voice breaking. "Are you okay? Have they been treating you all right?" "I'm fine," Dennis said. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down. I need to tell you something." Brenda sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked at her husband with a mixture of love and fear, not knowing what he was about to say. Dennis took a deep breath, and then he began to speak. "Andrea didn't run away," he said. Brenda's face went blank with shock. "What?" "She didn't run away. She's been dead since the night she disappeared." For a moment, Brenda couldn't speak. She stared at Dennis like she was looking at a stranger. Then the questions came tumbling out. "What do you mean? How? What happened?" And Dennis told her a story. Like his confession to Kathleen Doyle's murder, this story was a carefully constructed narrative designed to minimize his guilt and shift blame to the victim. According to Dennis, on the evening of March 11, 1989, he had come home with baby Vanessa to find Andrea packing a suitcase. When he confronted her and asked what she was doing, Andrea threatened him. She said she was going to tell her therapist again that he had been molesting her. She said she was going to make sure he went to prison. Dennis claimed they argued. He said he tried to reason with her, to convince her to stay and talk things through. But Andrea was determined to leave and to destroy him on her way out. At some point during this confrontation, Dennis said he struck Andrea. He claimed it was a reflexive action, not premeditated, just a slap or a push to get her to stop yelling. But Andrea fell backwards down the stairs from the second floor to the first floor landing. Dennis said he rushed to check on her. When he got to her, her head was tilted at an odd angle. Her eyes were open but vacant. He checked for a pulse and found none. Andrea, according to Dennis, had died from the fall. "It was an accident," Dennis told Brenda. "I didn't mean for her to die, but she fell, and when I checked her, she was gone." He said he panicked. He knew how it would look. Andrea had just accused him of molestation months earlier. He had a criminal history. If he called the police and said Andrea had died falling down the stairs during an argument, no one would believe it was an accident. They would think he killed her deliberately. They would send him to prison for decades. And he couldn't lose Brenda, he told her. He couldn't lose his family. He couldn't go to prison and be separated from them for the rest of his life. So he made a decision. He wrapped Andrea's body in a blanket and carried it out to the barn on their property. He hid it there while he figured out what to do. Later, he staged the scene in the house to make it look like Andrea had run away. He took the suitcase and the money to make it appear she had packed and left voluntarily. Then he reported her missing to the police. As for the body, Dennis told Brenda an outright lie. He said that a few days later, he had placed Andrea's body in a cardboard barrel and put it out with the neighbor's trash on garbage collection day. He claimed he believed the body had been taken to a landfill and incinerated. Brenda sat listening to this confession with tears streaming down her face. When Dennis finished speaking, there was a long silence. Then Brenda said something that would haunt investigators and shock anyone who later watched the interrogation video. "I forgive you," she said. "I still love you, Dennis. I know it was an accident. I know you didn't mean to hurt her." She reached across the table and took Dennis's hands in hers. "We'll get through this. I'll stand by you. I'm your wife, and I'm not abandoning you." Dennis began to cry, the first real emotion he had shown during any of the interrogations. Brenda came around the table and embraced him. The camera recorded them holding each other, two people bound together by decades of marriage and now by the shared knowledge of a terrible secret. Following Dennis's confession to Brenda about Andrea's death, investigators believed they finally had the breakthrough they needed. Dennis had admitted Andrea was dead. He had provided a story about how she died. All that remained was to confirm the disposal method and officially close the case. But something about Dennis's story didn't sit right with the investigators. The claim that he had put Andrea's body in a cardboard barrel and placed it with the neighbor's trash seemed too convenient, too clean. It was a disposal method that would leave no evidence behind, no body to discover, no way to verify or contradict Dennis's version of events. Moreover, it was incredibly risky. Placing a barrel containing a dead body in someone else's trash on collection day in broad daylight with neighbors potentially watching. It seemed like the kind of story someone would tell when they wanted to explain why a body would never be found. The investigators decided not to take Dennis's trash story at face value. Instead, they began monitoring his communications from jail. All phone calls and letters to and from inmates were subject to monitoring, and Dennis was no exception. Dennis and Brenda began exchanging letters regularly. Brenda's letters to Dennis were filled with declarations of love and support. She told him she believed his story about Andrea's death being an accident. She said she forgave him. She promised to visit him as often as she was allowed. Dennis's letters back to Brenda started out similarly, full of gratitude for her loyalty and protestations of love. But then the content of his letters began to shift in ways that directly contradicted what he had told her and investigators about Andrea's disposal. In a letter dated December 12, 2019, Dennis wrote to Brenda that he hadn't actually put Andrea's body in the trash. He said he had lied about that part. Instead, he had buried her in what he described as a private cemetery. This was new information. There was no cemetery on the Lincoln Road property or anywhere nearby that would qualify as a place Dennis could have secretly buried Andrea. So what was he talking about? In another letter, Dennis provided even more specific details. He described the clothing Andrea had been wearing when he buried her. Jeans, her favorite sweater, and a gold necklace. He wrote that over the past 30 years, he had walked past her burial site more than 100 times. This detail was crucial. If Dennis had walked past Andrea's grave more than 100 times over 30 years, that suggested she was buried somewhere on a property he frequented regularly. Not in a public cemetery, not in a remote location, but somewhere Dennis had regular access to. The only properties Dennis had regular access to were his family's residences. First, the farmhouse on Lincoln Road, where they lived when Andrea disappeared, and later the house on 134th Avenue in Hamilton, where they had moved in late 1989. Armed with these contradictions between Dennis's confession to Brenda and his letters to her, investigators confronted him again. You told Brenda that Andrea's body went to a landfill in the trash, but in your letters you say you buried her in a private cemetery and have walked past her grave over 100 times. Which is it, Dennis? Dennis remained silent, his jaw set stubbornly. We know you're lying about the trash, the investigator continued. Where is Andrea really buried? Dennis refused to answer. He folded his arms across his chest and stared at the wall. The investigators tried various approaches. They reminded him of the deal that would allow him to stay in Michigan and receive visits from Brenda. They pointed out that without the body, the deal was off, and he would be shipped to Virginia immediately. They appealed to whatever conscience he might have left, suggesting that Andrea deserved a proper burial and that Kathy Turkanian deserved to be able to lay her daughter to rest. Dennis remained unmoved. I'll take that information to my grave, he said finally. The investigators realized they had only one card left to play, Brenda. The investigators contacted Brenda and asked her to come back to the sheriff's office. When she arrived, they sat her down and explained the situation. Dennis had lied about the trash disposal. The letters proved it. He knew where Andrea was buried, but he was refusing to tell them. And because of his refusal, the deal to keep him in Michigan was going to fall through. He would be sent to Virginia, and Brenda would lose the ability to visit him regularly. We need your help, Mrs. Bowman, the investigator said gently. Dennis will listen to you. He cares what you think. If you talk to him, if you explain that he needs to tell us where Andrea is, I think he'll do it. Brenda was torn. Her loyalty to Dennis was absolute, but she was also practical. She wanted to be able to visit her husband. She wanted to maintain the connection they had built over 40-plus years of marriage. And somewhere, buried beneath her denial and her enabling of Dennis's behavior, there was perhaps a small part of her that thought Andrea deserved better than to rot in an unmarked grave in a backyard. Brenda agreed to talk to Dennis. She was given access to him on the phone, and the investigators listened in as she made her appeal. Dennis, you need to tell them where she is, Brenda said. If you don't, they're going to send you to Virginia, and I won't be able to see you. Is that what you want? Dennis was hesitant. He had spent 30 years keeping the location of Andrea's body a secret. Revealing it meant giving up the last piece of control he had. But Brenda pressed on. I want to give her a proper cremation, Dennis. She deserves that, please. Tell them where she is. The mention of cremation seemed to resonate with Dennis. Perhaps the idea of Andrea being cremated rather than left in the ground appealed to him. Perhaps the thought of her remains being handled in a respectful way assuaged some guilt he hadn't fully acknowledged. Or perhaps he simply realized that Brenda was right about the practical reality. If he didn't cooperate, he would lose his only connection to the outside world. Finally, Dennis agreed to tell them. But when he began to speak, the story he told was even more disturbing than the one about the trash. Dennis admitted that yes, he had initially buried Andrea in the backyard of the Lincoln Road farmhouse the night she died. He had dug a grave in the dark and placed her body in the ground, covering it with dirt and smoothing over the earth so it wouldn't be immediately obvious that the ground had been disturbed. Andrea had remained there 6 feet beneath the backyard where the Bowman family had barbecues and where baby Vanessa played on sunny afternoons for several months. Then when Dennis and Brenda decided to move to Hamilton, Dennis was faced with a problem. He couldn't leave Andrea's body behind at Lincoln Road. What if the new owners dug up the yard for a garden or a pool? What if they decided to put in a fence and hit the grave while digging post holes? Dennis couldn't take that risk, so he made a decision that most people would find incomprehensible. Under cover of darkness one night before the move, Dennis returned to the Lincoln Road property alone. He brought a shovel and digging tools. He dug up Andrea's remains, which had been decomposing in the ground for months by this point. He placed what was left of his daughter into large trash bags. Then he transported those bags to the new property on 134th Avenue in Hamilton, and he reburied Andrea in the backyard of their new home. This meant that Andrea's body had been moved with the family when they relocated. She had been exhumed from one grave and reburied in another, carried across county lines by the man who killed her, kept close so Dennis could maintain control over the evidence of his crime. Where exactly on the property is she buried? The investigator asked. Dennis provided specific directions. He described a location in the backyard near the fence line. He described it being under a particular section of the yard that had grass growing over it, but which looked slightly different from the surrounding lawn. The investigator felt a chill. The location Dennis was describing matched perfectly with the disturbed patch of earth that Kathy Turkanian had identified years earlier on Google Earth. Kathy, using nothing but satellite imagery and maternal intuition, had found her daughter's grave. Law enforcement immediately made plans to excavate the property on 134th Avenue. On a cold December day in 2019, heavy equipment rolled onto the property on 134th Avenue in Hamilton, Michigan. The excavation team consisted of investigators from multiple jurisdictions, forensic experts, the county medical examiner, and operators of the digging equipment. News crews gathered on the street outside, kept at a distance by police barriers, their cameras trained on the backyard where the excavation would take place. Kathy Turkanian was not allowed to be present at the scene. The excavation was an active crime scene investigation, and only essential personnel were permitted access. But Kathy was in Michigan, staying at a hotel nearby, waiting for news. The excavation team used Dennis's directions to identify the specific area to dig. Ground-penetrating radar was employed to get a sense of what might be beneath the surface before the heavy equipment disturbed the earth. The radar showed an anomaly in the soil consistent with a burial. Something was down there. The excavator began carefully removing layers of soil. The work was slow and methodical. They couldn't simply dig a hole quickly because they needed to preserve any evidence that might be present. Several feet down, the excavator bucket revealed something that made the operator stop immediately. A large black trash bag was visible in the dirt. The excavator was shut off, and forensic investigators moved in with hand tools to carefully expose and extract the bag without damaging it. As they worked, it became clear that there wasn't just one bag. There were multiple bags nested within each other. A large outer bag contained 4 smaller bags inside. The contents of the bags were exactly what Dennis had described, though seeing it was still horrific. Along with Andrea's remains, there were used diapers. Dennis had apparently placed diapers in the bags to mask the scent of decomposition, preventing cadaver dogs or curious animals from detecting the grave. There was also a candy wrapper in the bags, the kind of mundane detail that makes cold case evidence so heartbreaking. The wrapper was dated 1989, a small piece of temporal evidence confirming that these remains had been buried around the time of Andrea's disappearance. The bags were carefully extracted from the ground and transported to the medical examiner's office for processing. DNA analysis would be performed to officially confirm the identity of the remains, though at this point there was little doubt. Within days, the DNA results came back. The remains found in the backyard of 134th Avenue belonged to Andrea Michelle Bowman. After 30 years, Andrea had been found. She had been there all along, exactly where Kathy had believed, buried in a backyard grave while her killer lived his life just steps away from where he had hidden her. The discovery of Andrea's remains generated national news coverage. The case that had gone cold in 1989, the teenage girl whose face had appeared in the Runaway Train video, was suddenly front-page news again. For Kathy Turkanian, the confirmation that the remains were Andrea's was both devastating and oddly relieving. For years, she had lived with uncertainty, not knowing if her daughter was alive somewhere or if she was dead. Now she knew. The not knowing was over. But knowing brought its own kind of pain. Kathy learned the full details of how Andrea had been killed, where she had been buried, and how Dennis had exhumed and reburied her when the family moved. She learned that for 30 years, Andrea had been in that backyard while Dennis went about his life, attending church, working at his job, pretending to be a grieving father whose daughter had run away. The phone call Kathy received from Brenda Bowman after the discovery was perhaps the most painful moment of all. Brenda called to tell Kathy that she was having Andrea's remains cremated. Then, as a gesture she seemed to believe was generous, Brenda offered to give half of the ashes to Kathy. To Kathy, this offer felt like a final insult. Brenda was splitting Andrea in half. Even in death, Andrea was being divided between the woman who gave birth to her and the woman who raised her. It felt like Brenda was still trying to assert some ownership over Andrea, still trying to maintain control. Kathy declined the offer of half the ashes. She told Brenda to keep all of them. She couldn't bear the thought of her daughter being split apart, even in this symbolic way. In February 2022, more than 2 years after his arrest, Dennis Bowman appeared in court to face charges in Andrea's death. The prosecution had charged him with first-degree murder, but Dennis's attorneys negotiated a plea deal. Dennis agreed to plead no contest to second-degree murder in exchange for avoiding a trial. Pleading no contest meant Dennis was not admitting guilt, but he was acknowledging that the prosecution had enough evidence to convict him. It was a legal maneuver that allowed him to avoid the finality of a guilty plea while still accepting the consequences. At the sentencing hearing, the judge presiding over the case made clear his feelings about Dennis Bowman. He stated that in his decades on the bench, he had seen very few cases as disturbing as this one. A father murdering his adopted daughter, hiding her body for 30 years, moving it to maintain control, lying to his wife and the police and the community, all while presenting himself as a respectable church-going family man. The judge sentenced Dennis to serve 35 to 50 years in prison. Given that Dennis was 72 years old at sentencing, this was effectively a life sentence. He would die in prison. But that wasn't the end of Dennis's legal troubles. The plea deal that Michigan had negotiated included a provision that Dennis would serve his Michigan sentence first before being transferred to Virginia to face the murder charges for Kathleen Doyle. In Virginia, Dennis had already been convicted based on the DNA evidence. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms for Kathleen's murder, the sexual assault, and other charges. The legal maneuvering meant that Dennis would spend whatever time he had left in Michigan prison, receiving visits from Brenda if she chose to make them, before eventually being transferred to Virginia, where he would remain until his death. Today, Dennis Lee Bowman is 75 years old and incarcerated at the River North Correctional Center in Independence, Virginia. According to prison records, he has had no disciplinary violations and has not participated in any educational or rehabilitative programs. He keeps to himself in prison, much as he kept to himself in his civilian life, presenting a quiet exterior while harboring dark secrets beneath. Brenda Bowman remains married to Dennis. She has stood by her declaration that she forgives him and that her marriage vows are sacred. She continues to live in Michigan. Their daughter Vanessa is now in her mid-30s. She has largely stayed out of the public eye, understandably traumatized by the revelations about her father and the half-sisters she never really knew. The farmhouse on Lincoln Road where Andrea was first buried no longer belongs to the Bowman family. The property has changed hands at least once since Dennis's arrest, and the new owners are presumably aware of its dark history. The house on 134th Avenue, where Andrea's remains were found, also no longer belongs to Brenda Bowman. Whether she sold it voluntarily or whether financial pressures forced the sale is unclear, but she no longer lives at the address where Andrea's grave was discovered. Kathy Turkanian continues to live in Virginia. She has become an advocate for birth mothers' rights in adoption cases, arguing that biological parents should have access to information about their children's well-being even after adoption. The closed adoption system that prevented her from knowing anything about Andrea's life or circumstances failed Andrea completely, and Kathy wants to see reforms that might prevent similar tragedies. The case has prompted some discussion about mandatory follow-up in adoption cases, particularly when adoptive parents have criminal histories. Dennis Bowman's conviction for assault with a deadly weapon occurred after he had adopted Andrea, but before her disappearance. And yet no social service agency ever questioned whether Andrea was safe in his care. Advocates like Kathy argue that adoptive families should be subject to ongoing review, not just a one-time home study before placement. There is also ongoing discussion about the failure of Child Protective Services to properly investigate Andrea's allegation of abuse in November 1988. That failed intervention represents a critical missed opportunity that might have saved Andrea's life. The social worker who accepted Dennis and Brenda's explanation without further investigation has never publicly commented on the case, but it's likely a decision that haunts them to this day. Even with Dennis's confessions and Andrea's body recovered, there are aspects of this case that remain murky and probably always will. Dennis's claim that Andrea's death was an accident, that she fell down the stairs during an argument, is highly suspect. Dennis has a demonstrated pattern of minimizing his crimes. He claimed Kathleen Doyle's death was an accident when in fact it was a brutal, prolonged assault. There's no reason to believe his version of events regarding Andrea is any more truthful. The autopsy of Andrea's remains after 30 years of decomposition made it difficult to determine the exact cause of death or to identify all injuries she might have sustained. Soft tissue had long since decomposed, making it impossible to see evidence of strangulation, bruising, or other injuries that would have been obvious if she had been found shortly after death. Many investigators believe that Dennis killed Andrea deliberately, possibly in a rage after she threatened again to report his abuse. The story about a fall down the stairs may be entirely fabricated to make the killing seem less premeditated. There is also the question of whether Andrea was Dennis's only child victim or whether there might have been others. Dennis's pattern of predatory behavior toward women is well documented through his convictions. His admission to attacks in San Diego and the trailer park incident show that his criminal behavior was more extensive than just the cases where he was caught. Could there have been other missing girls or young women whose disappearances were attributed to running away, but who actually fell victim to Dennis Bowman? Investigators have looked into this possibility, cross-referencing missing persons cases from areas where Dennis lived or worked, but no definitive links have been established. The most haunting question is simply, how much suffering could have been prevented if the system had worked the way it was supposed to? If Dennis had served his full 10-year sentence for the attempted abduction in 1980, instead of being released after 5 years, he would have still been in prison in March 1989 when Andrea disappeared. Andrea might still be alive. If the psychological evaluation that deemed Dennis a danger to women had been taken more seriously, if conditions of his release had included restrictions on his contact with children or vulnerable individuals, Andrea might have been protected. If the Child Protective Services investigation in November 1988 had been more thorough, if Andrea's allegation had been believed instead of dismissed, she could have been removed from the home before Dennis killed her. If Brenda Bowman had prioritized her daughter's safety over her loyalty to her husband, if she had left Dennis after learning about his criminal history, both Vanessa and Andrea might have grown up in a household free from violence. The failures are numerous and systemic, and they resulted in a 14-year-old girl dying at the hands of the man who was supposed to protect her. The case of Andrea Bowman is a tragedy on multiple levels. It's the story of a birth mother who made the selfless decision to give her child up for adoption in hopes of providing a better life, only to discover decades later that her sacrifice led to horror. It's the story of a child who reached out for help and was failed by every adult and system that should have protected her. It's the story of a predator who hid behind respectability and religion while committing terrible acts of violence. It's also a story about the power of persistence and advocacy. Carl Koppelman's dedication to cold case research, Kathy Turkanian's refusal to give up searching for answers, the Norfolk cold case detectives who used new technology to solve a 40-year-old murder, all of these people played a role in finally bringing Dennis Bowman to justice. Andrea Bowman never got the chance to grow up. She never graduated high school, never fell in love, never pursued her dreams. She was trapped in a nightmare household, and when she tried to escape, either physically or by asking for help, she was killed and buried in a backyard grave where she remained for 3 decades. But her story is not forgotten. Her photograph is no longer a missing person poster, but a memorial to a life stolen too soon. And Dennis Bowman, the man who killed her and hid her and lied about her for 30 years, will spend the rest of his life in prison, his secrets finally exposed. If you appreciate the deep research and comprehensive coverage we bring to cases like Andrea's here at Cold Case Desk, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment letting us know what you think. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into cases that took years or decades to solve. And if you know someone who went missing and whose case has gone cold, never stop searching for answers. Andrea's case shows that even after 30 years, the truth can still come to light. Thank you for watching Cold Case Desk. Stay safe, and remember, the truth may be buried, but it's never truly gone.